Hey there and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe you've pulled a blanket up around you, maybe there's a cup of something nearby. Good. Stay where you are. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Tonight we are going to spend a long evening with one person. Her name was Princess Amelia. She was the youngest of 15 children of King George III and Queen Charlotte. She was, by every account that survives, her father's favourite child. She lived for 27 years. She was loved deeply and steadily for the whole of that time. And at the end of her life, when she finally died on a grey autumn afternoon in 1810, she took her father's sanity with her, and the British Constitution had to be reorganised around her absence. That is, in outline, the story we are going to walk through tonight. It is one of the great stories of the late Georgian period. It has been, until very recently, almost unknown outside the specialist literature on the royal family. Her letters were sealed in the royal archives for nearly 2 centuries and only released to scholars in the last few years. The story we have, by 2026, is fuller than the story anyone could have told as recently as 10 years ago. It is, in many ways, a story about love. Not just the love of her parents and her siblings, although those will run all through tonight, but the secret love of her late 20s, the doomed romantic attachment that gave the last decade of her life its architecture. Tonight we are going to walk through the whole of it, slowly, year by year, scene by scene, with the sort of patient attention that her short life deserves. I will warn you before we begin that this is going to be a sad story in places. Princess Amelia died young. She was ill for most of her adult life. She was unable to marry the man she loved. The end of her life was difficult, and the effect of her death on her father was devastating. We are going to handle all of that with the care it deserves, and we are not going to dwell on the medical detail any longer than the story requires. But the sadness is part of the truth. I want you to know it is coming so that you can settle into the evening with appropriate expectations. There will also be a great deal of warmth in tonight's story. There will be music and gardens and the sea at Weymouth, and the love of sisters for each other, and the genuine devotion of a father to a daughter that does not, even in the worst stretches of his own illness, quite let go of her. The story is sad. The story is also, in its central material, about love. We will hold both at once. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you, whether you are here to drift gently into sleep or to follow the long arc of her life through to the end. I am glad you are with me, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss an evening like this one. Let us begin. We begin in the summer of 1783. The place is Windsor, in the wooded estate that surrounds Windsor Castle, on a hot July evening in one of the warmest summers anyone in England can remember. The sky is a clear pale blue, the air is soft. The trees of the great park, which runs south from the castle for several miles in a long stretch of oak and chestnut and beech, are in their full midsummer leaf, and the long shadows of the late afternoon are reaching through the lawns and the gravel paths. 2 miles south of the castle, in a wooded part of the park, stands a 2-story building called the Royal Lodge, sometimes called the Lower Lodge. It is a comfortable house rather than a grand one, built in the pinkish brick from that era, with white-painted window frames and a steep slate roof and chimneys at either end. It is set back from the main carriage drive of the park, in a clearing surrounded by mature trees with a lawn at the front and a kitchen garden at the back. It is the type of building that the British royal family of the late 18th century used as a retreat, away from the more formal apartments at the castle, when the king and queen wanted to be quietly with their children. This evening, the royal lodge is at the centre of a drama. Inside, in an upstairs bedroom on the south side of the house, the queen is in labour. She is 39 years old. She has borne 14 children already in the 22 years of her marriage, and she is delivering her 15th. The labour is, by the standards of the Queen's previous deliveries, not difficult, but it is being managed with the same care that the household applies to every royal birth. The senior physician in the next room, the midwife at the bedside, a set of senior women, including her closest ladies-in-waiting, the king himself in an adjoining chamber waiting for the news. It is just after sunrise on the morning of the 7th of August, 1783, when the news comes. The Queen has delivered safely. The child is a daughter. She is healthy. She is, by the immediate report, beautiful and pink and well-formed, with the dark hair that the Queen's children mostly had, with strong lungs, with the clear cry of a healthy newborn. The king, when he receives the news, weeps. I want you to understand why he weeps, because the why of it shapes everything that comes after. The king has just lost 2 children in the previous year and a half. The 13th child, Prince Octavius, born in February of 1779, died in May of 1783, just 3 months ago, at the age of 4. He had been the king's favourite. The 14th child, Prince Alfred, born in September of 1780, died in August of 1782, 12 months ago, at the age of 1 year and 10 months. The 2 boys had been at Kew in the family nursery when they fell ill. The exact illnesses are not entirely clear from the records, although Alfred's death is generally attributed to complications of his smallpox inoculation and Octavius's, similarly, to a serious illness shortly after his own inoculation. The medical understanding of its time was limited. The treatments available were limited. The 2 boys, who had been bright and affectionate and adored, were, in the space of a year, gone. The king, who was a serious and devoted father, took the deaths very hard. He could not, his contemporaries said, walk past the bench at the orangery at Kew where Octavius had liked to sit without grief. He had Octavius's portrait painted from memory, and he kept it in his dressing room for the rest of his life. He spoke about Octavius constantly. He had a box of Octavius's belongings which he kept by his bed, and he opened it sometimes in the hours of the night when he could not sleep. Alfred had been smaller and less known to him personally, because Alfred died at 1 year and 10 months, and had not yet entered the more visible part of family life. But Alfred had been loved too, in the distributed way that the king loved all of his children, and Alfred's death, coming as it did less than a year before Octavius's, had laid down a kind of compounding grief that the king did not entirely recover from. I want you to picture, briefly, the king in the months between the 2 deaths and Amelia's birth. The spring of 1783, he is at Windsor often, walking in the gardens at Kew when he is in town, walking in the great park when he is at the castle. He walks alone more than he used to. The household notes it. He stops, sometimes, in front of benches in the garden. The bench at Kew where Octavius had liked to sit on afternoons. The bench in the orangery where the boy had been observed by one of the gardeners feeding pieces of his biscuit to the sparrows on the gravel. And he stands looking at the bench for several minutes before walking on. He goes into the chapel at Kew, occasionally, and sits in one of the back pews for a quarter of an hour, with no religious purpose that the household can identify, simply sitting. He writes In the notebook he keeps for personal reflections, a few brief entries that survive short, simple, concerning the difficulty of the spring, the absent presence of his sons, the consoling expectation of the new child whose birth is approaching. The Queen, who is the principal observer of his state in this period, is concerned. She has watched him through every previous bereavement of their married life, the deaths of his mother, of various siblings, of various of the political and personal losses that 23 years of marriage have brought. He has, in every previous case, recovered. She is not certain in the spring of 1783 that he will recover from this one. The compound grief of 2 children in 12 months has produced in him a quality of withdrawal that is new. He is at the work of the kingship. He attends his levees. He receives his ministers. He signs his papers. But the warmth that has, for the whole of their marriage, been the central feature of his presence in their household is, in this spring, less reliably present. He is in some way still partly with the dead boys. The new pregnancy, which will produce Amelia, is therefore freighted with more than the ordinary parental hope. The Queen needs the child to arrive safely. She needs the child to live. The whole household, watching the pregnancy of the spring and summer of 1783, is watching it as a test of whether the family can recover from the difficult year and a half that has just been endured. If the child arrives healthy and lives, the household will, in the way of these things, repair itself. If the child does not, if there is a third loss, the Queen is not certain what will happen. Hence the weeping on the morning of the 7th of August. The king, holding the new daughter in his arms in the upstairs bedroom of the royal lodge, is weeping for the 2 boys he has buried, for the daughter he has just gained, for the repair that he can already feel beginning in his own chest, for the 1,000 things that the arrival of a healthy newborn into a grieving household always brings. Amelia is, in the theology of the household, the child who came when the children were needed. She is, even before she is fully a person, already the repair that her parents had been hoping for through the long, anxious spring. Now, in August of 1783, just weeks after the death of his second favourite child, the Queen has delivered him a 15th, a daughter, healthy, pink, strong. He weeps. He weeps because he had thought during the long, anxious months of the Queen's pregnancy that the child might not survive. He weeps because he had been afraid, in the private way of a parent who has just buried 2 children, that he could not bear another loss. He weeps because the new baby is not Octavius, and never will be, but is also a living thing that has just arrived in his house, and that needs to be loved, and that he is, despite himself, immediately ready to love. He goes upstairs. He sees his wife, who is exhausted but alive and well. He sees the new baby, who is in the arms of one of the senior nurses, wrapped in the embroidered linen blanket that the household keeps for new infants. He takes the baby from the nurse. He holds her. He looks at her face. She is beautiful. The reports from the household over the next several weeks will all converge on this. She is one of the prettiest of all the king's children. Her older sister Charlotte, the Princess Royal, will write to her brother William a month later, "Our littlest sister is without exception one of the prettiest children I have ever seen." The king holds her. He gives her a kiss. He hands her back to the nurse. He goes downstairs to write the formal announcement of the birth that will be sent to the Privy Council in London, and that will, over the course of the following day, propagate through the official channels into the newspapers and the court gazettes and the public consciousness of the country. The 15th child of King George III and Queen Charlotte is born. Her name, at the family's choice, will be Amelia, after the king's aunt Princess Amelia, the daughter of King George II. The official christening will take place on the 17th of September at the Chapel Royal, St James's Palace, with the Archbishop of Canterbury performing the ceremony. But to her father, from this morning forward, she will not be Amelia. She will be Emily. Emily is the private name that the king will use for her for the whole of her life. Emily in the nursery, Emily in the schoolroom, Emily in the long letters between the king and his daughters that fill the family archives. Emily in the notes the king writes to her when she is ill at Weymouth in her teens and 20s. Emily in the broken, delirious cries that the king will give in the final stretches of his own illness, when he believes she is alive in Hanover with a large family of her own. Emily, from the morning of her birth to the moment of his death and beyond, is what the king calls his 15th and youngest child. I want to spend a few minutes, while she is in the nursery sleeping that first day, on the family she has been born into, because the family she enters on the 7th of August, 1783, is one of the most remarkable royal households in British history, and the details of it are part of the texture of her whole life. Her father, King George III, is 45 years old. He has been on the throne for 23 years. He came to the throne in 1760, at the age of 22, on the death of his grandfather George II, and he has spent his adult life in the long work of being king. He is, by every contemporary account, a serious and conscientious monarch. The two roles are, in his own self-conception, not separate. He has built a family life that is, by the standards of his own ancestors and his own contemporaries among the European royal houses, unusually domestic, unusually warm, and unusually focused on the actual upbringing of his actual children. He plays with them. He reads to them. He takes them to the theatre. He asks them about their lessons. He writes them notes when they are unwell. The whole family life of the British royal household in 1783 is shaped by the king's deliberate decision that he wants to be present for his children in a way that his own father was not present for him. Her mother, Queen Charlotte, is 39 years old. She is the daughter of a German duchy called Mecklenburg-Strelitz, brought to England at the age of 17 to marry a king she had never met, and now, 22 years later, the long-serving consort of the British monarch and the mother of 15 of his children. She is, by every contemporary account, a serious, intelligent, anxious, and somewhat reserved woman, with a love of books and music and gardens, and an eye for the management of her enormous household. She is, by the time of Amelia's birth, beginning to show the strain of the long years of childbearing and household management. She will not bear any more children after Amelia. The 15th daughter will, in the narrowing of her body's capacity, be the last. Amelia's siblings, when she is born, are a substantial cohort. The eldest, George, the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, is 21 years old, already an adult, already showing the signs of the difficult and self-indulgent character that will define his later life. Frederick, the second son, is 20. William III is 17. Charlotte, the eldest daughter and Princess Royal, is 17. Edward is 16. Augusta is 15. Elizabeth is 13. Ernest is 12. Augustus is 10. Adolphus is 9. Mary is 7. Sophia is 6. There is a long 6-year gap between Sophia and Amelia, which is the gap left by the deaths of Octavius and Alfred. Amelia, in the family arrangement, comes after that gap. She is the new beginning after a difficult stretch. The principal residences of the family in 1783 are 3. The first is the Queen's House, the building in central London at the western end of the Mall that the king bought in 1762 as a private home for his wife, and that, after considerable rebuilding by John Nash in the 1820s, will eventually become Buckingham Palace. The Queen's house is where the family spends its winters and where most of the children, including Amelia, do their formal lessons. The second is Kew, the estate on the south bank of the Thames, where the family spends most of its summers, and where the king's mother had built up the substantial botanic garden that is now the centre of his own horticultural interests. The third is Windsor, the great medieval castle west of London, where the family spends the autumns, and where the king likes to be, in the long wooded landscape of the great park, with the lodges and the deer and the rooms of the castle full of paintings and books. Amelia, born at the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, is the only one of the 15 royal children not born at the Queen's house. The choice of birthplace was the Queen's. She had been at Windsor through the summer, in the relative cool of the wooded estate, and when the labour came on she did not move. The Royal Lodge, on the 7th of August 1783, is the first home of the youngest and last of George III's children. I want to set the political moment of her birth briefly, because it shaped the public response to her arrival. The summer of 1783 was, for the British state, a difficult moment. The American Revolution had ended only the previous year. The Treaty of Paris, the formal settlement that recognized the independence of the United States, had been signed in September 1783, just a few weeks after Amelia's birth. The country had lost the war. The country had lost the colonies. The country was, in the self-assessment of its political class, beginning the work of recovering from a serious defeat. The king himself had taken the loss of America very personally. He had, in the worst stretches of the previous winter, spoken openly about the possibility of abdicating in favour of his son, on the grounds that he had failed in his duty as a monarch. He had been talked out of it by his ministers, but the underlying mood of the spring and summer of 1783 was, in the king's case, one of considerable private discouragement. Into this difficult political moment, the new daughter arrived. The country, which had been waiting through a difficult 18 months for some piece of good news from the royal household, took the birth as exactly that. The newspapers reported the arrival warmly. The provincial cities held unofficial celebrations. The members of the political class, both in the government and in the opposition, sent in their formal congratulations with the extra warmth that the difficulty of the moment encouraged. The new princess, who would not have been understood as a political asset in calmer circumstances, became in the awkward summer of 1783 a bright public symbol of the country's continuity, of the family's resilience, of the private fact that even in difficult times life went on, and new arrivals continued to take their places in the running order of the world. The king, who had been in the private grief of Octavius and Alfred all spring, found in the birth a public occasion that was easy for him to be straightforwardly happy about. He gave generous gratuities to the household staff at the Royal Lodge. He authorised the customary celebrations at Windsor bonfires in the lower ward of the castle, a ration of beer for the estate workers, the firing of a 41-gun salute from the parade ground. He sat down on the evening of the 8th of August, with the Queen still recovering upstairs, and wrote out, in his own hand, the formal letters of announcement to the senior crowned heads of Europe, to his cousin in Hanover, to his sister in Denmark, to the courts of France, and Prussia, and Austria, and Russia. The letters, which survive in various archives, are the formal letters of a king to his peers. The handwriting in each of them is steadier than it has been in the king's other correspondence of the spring. The business of writing them, in the evening hours of the day after his daughter's birth, was, for him, a piece of recovery work that the family had been needing for a long time. She sleeps through that first day. She is wrapped in the linen blanket. She is in a wooden cradle that has been brought down from the upper floor and set in her mother's room beside the bed, so that the Queen can see her sleeping. The Queen, exhausted from the labour, sleeps on and off through the morning and the afternoon. The senior nurse sits in the chair by the cradle, watching the baby breathe. The light through the south-facing window of the bedroom moves slowly over the floor as the day proceeds. The summer afternoon at Windsor in early August is one of the great pleasures of the English year. The trees of the great park stand still in the air. The grass on the lawns is dry and pale gold from a long spell. A few birds, wood pigeons, blackbirds, the finches of the wood, are calling intermittently from the canopy. The smell of the cut grass, mixed with the earth smell of the gravel paths and the faint sweet smell of the late roses still in flower against the south wall of the lodge, comes in through the open window when the wind moves. There is, in the air of the bedroom, a sense of the world having opened to admit the new arrival. Stand at the window for a moment in our imagination. Look out around the lawn at the front of the lodge. The lawn is perhaps 50 yards across, ending at a line of mature oaks and chestnuts that mark the edge of the immediate grounds. Beyond the trees, the deer park stretches away to the south, where you can see, through the gaps in the canopy, the pale shapes of the fallow deer grazing in the open glades. A single gravel carriage drive leads up to the front of the lodge from the main road through the park, perhaps a quarter of a mile away. There is a stone urn at each side of the drive where it meets the lawn, with cascading red geraniums spilling over the rims. There are climbing roses on the south wall of the lodge itself. The flowers are deep clear pink, late in their season, but still abundant with the rose petal scent rising on the afternoon air. A bee is working one of the open flowers. A blackbird is singing from somewhere in the big oak just to the right of the lawn. The whole scene, at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 7th of August 1783, is the ordinary picture of an English country house garden in midsummer, with the additional fact that one of the upstairs windows holds, for the first day of her life, the new daughter of the king. The king comes back upstairs several times through the day just to look at her. He stands at the side of the cradle. He watches her sleep. He says, very quietly, the phrases that the parents of any new baby say in the first hours after the birth, the comments on her hair, on her hands, on the sounds she makes in her sleep. The senior nurse, who has been with the family for several of the previous births, watches him discreetly. She has seen him do this before. Each new baby gets the same long attention from the king in the first hours of its life. He is, the nurse reflects, a good father. He is perhaps the best of the fathers she has worked for. By evening, the household has begun to settle into the new arrangement. The baby has fed. The Queen has eaten a light meal. The senior physicians have made their final visit of the day and pronounced both mother and child to be in excellent health. The official announcement has gone out from Windsor to London by fast rider, and by the time the king sits down to his own supper in the dining room downstairs, the news of the birth is already running through the upper households of London by the morning newspapers. The news will be public along the country, and by the end of the week the official letters of congratulation will be arriving from the courts of Europe. The light outside the window is going golden now as the afternoon turns toward evening. The shadows of the oaks at the edge of the lawn are reaching throughout the grass. The deer in the park are coming out of the cover of the trees to graze in the cooler air of the evening. The swallows that nest in the eaves of the lodge are circling above the lawn, hunting the insects that rise from the grass. The whole estate is settling, in the way of a country house at the end of a hot summer day, into its evening routines. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps a mile away, the bell of one of the chapels in the great park rings the 7 o'clock. The sound carries softly in the still air. The baby, Amelia, Emily, the 15th and final child, sleeps on in the wooden cradle by her mother's bed in the upstairs bedroom of the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park on the clear evening of the 7th of August 1783. The world she has been born into is, for this first night, the bounded world of one room, one cradle, one new parent attached to her as the king is already attached to her. The much larger world that will eventually press in on her, the world of the public role she will play, the world of her father's illness, the world of the man she will fall in love with and will not be allowed to marry, the world of the long illness that will take her at 27, all of that is, for tonight, still ahead of her. She is 1 day old. She is asleep. She is, for this evening, simply alive. The years from 1783 to 1788, Amelia's first 5 years, are the happiest stretch of her childhood. The household at Windsor, where the family spends most of the autumns, and at Kew, where it spends the summers, is at its most settled. The king is at the height of his middle years, in good health, in a political position, much loved by the public. The queen, although tired from the long sequence of births, is competent and managing the routines of the family with her usual attention. The older children are mostly out of the schoolroom. The Prince of Wales, 21 when Amelia is born, is launching himself on the long career of fashionable scandal that will define his adult life. But the younger children, those still in the nursery, are flourishing. I want you to picture Amelia in the nursery at Windsor in, say, the autumn of 1785, when she is 2 years old. She is a small, dark-haired, blue-eyed child with the chubby cheeks and the quick movements of any healthy 2-year-old. She is wearing the white embroidered dress that the period used for both boys and girls at this age. Long, simple, falling to the ankle, with a sash at the waist and a lace collar. She has leather slippers on her feet. Her hair, dark and curly, is held back from her face with a narrow ribbon. The nursery at Windsor is one of the warmest rooms in the upstairs apartments of the castle. It is a long room on the south side of the Queen's apartments, with 2 tall windows facing onto the great park, and a fireplace at one end where a fire is kept burning through the cooler months. The walls are painted a cream. There is a thick carpet on the floor, in the greens and pinks that the period preferred for nurseries. There is a wooden rocking horse against one wall, a beautifully made horse, perhaps 3 feet tall, with a real horsehair mane and tail, and a leather saddle painted in dapple grey on a white ground. There is a low cabinet with the wooden toys the children play with alphabet blocks, wooden animals, a doll's house with miniature furniture, a set of wooden soldiers for the boys. There is in the corner near the fire a low chair where the senior nurse sits, with a footstool and a work basket beside her. The smell of the nursery in the cool autumn afternoon is the smell of a well-kept children's room in a great house. There is the dry smell of the wood fire, with the sweet note of the applewood logs that the household burns for the smaller fireplaces. There is the faint, clean smell of soap from the children's morning baths, still hanging in the bedroom through the corridor. There is the paper and ink smell of the children's lesson books on the low table by the window. There is the milky smell of children themselves, which any nursery has, and which the parent of any era recognizes immediately. The senior nurse, who has been with the family since the birth of the eldest child, Charlotte, 23 years ago, considers the smell of the nursery to be the signature of her own working life. The room is full of children. Amelia, 2 years old, is on the carpet near the fire, building an uncertain tower of alphabet blocks that keeps falling over. Her sister Sophia, 8 years old, is sitting on the floor beside her, helping. Her sister Mary, 9 years old, is at the table by the window, drawing a study of an autumn leaf that one of the under-nurses has brought in from the garden, with the fine pencil strokes that Mary will, by her teens, be able to deploy in the precise watercolour studies that her drawing master has been teaching her. Her sister Augusta, 16, is reading aloud to the smaller girls, something light, perhaps a fairy tale, perhaps one of the moral fables that the period considered suitable for young children. 2 of the under-nurses are at the back of the room, mending items of children's clothing. The senior nurse is in her chair by the fire, watching everything. Light coming in through the south windows is the golden light of an English autumn afternoon, slanting over the carpet at a low angle. Outside the windows, the trees of the great park have begun their autumn colour. The oaks are still mostly green, but the chestnuts are turning to deep gold and copper, and a few of the early turning species have already dropped their leaves onto the lawns below. The sky beyond is a pale blue with a few high clouds. The view from the nursery windows on this afternoon is a form of view that the Copley portrait will, 3 years later, attempt to capture in paint. The king is in the doorway. He has come up from his study, where he has been writing letters, for a few minutes' visit before the children are taken downstairs to be presented at the formal family gathering in the late afternoon. Amelia, on the floor by the fire, looks up. She sees him. She breaks into a smile, the total uncomplicated smile of a child who has just spotted her favourite person, and pushes herself up onto her feet, leaving the alphabet blocks scattered around the carpet, and toddles toward him with her arms outstretched. The king crosses the room. He drops to one knee on the carpet by every contemporary account. This is exactly what he routinely does in the nursery, drops to the children's level rather than making them come up to his, and catches Amelia as she reaches him. He picks her up. He swings her gently in the air. She laughs, the bright laugh of a child being lifted by a strong adult, and the laugh carries along the room and makes Sophia look up from the alphabet blocks and Mary look up from her drawing and the senior nurse work basket. The king laughs in return. He sits down on the carpet with Amelia on his lap, and the ritual that the household has come to know well begins. The king plays with his youngest daughter on the nursery floor for 10 or 15 minutes, every day that he can manage it, in the late afternoon between his correspondence and the formal duties of the evening. The other children, scattered around the nursery, continue their own activities, but they keep half an eye on the King and Emily scene unfolding by the fire. They are used to it. They are not jealous of it. They understand in the clear way that children always understand the inner workings of their families, that Emily is the king's favourite, and that the special attention is one of the fixed facts of the household. A family friend visiting Windsor in this period will write later, "I never saw more lovely children, nor a more pleasing sight than the king's fondness for them." That sentence captures, more than any other contemporary observation, the texture of Amelia's early childhood, the lovely children, the fond father, the pleasing sight. It was a family that in its first years around her was working as well as a royal family then could be expected to work, and Amelia was the sun around which the king's afternoon affections orbited. There is one image of Amelia from this period that survives, and that I want to spend a moment on, because it is the visual record we have of her at the height of her early childhood. In 1785, when Amelia was 2, the American-born painter John Singleton Copley was commissioned to paint a group portrait of the 3 youngest princesses, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia. The painting, which still hangs in the royal collection, shows the 3 girls together in a pastoral garden setting, with a white dog at their feet and a basket of fruit beside them. Mary, the eldest of the 3, is 9 years old in the painting, in a white dress with a blue sash, holding a tambourine. Sophia, in the middle, is 8, in a pink dress, looking out at the viewer with the grave expression that children sometimes have for portraits. Amelia, the smallest, is 2, in a long white dress, standing on a low stone step, holding the leash of the dog and looking up at her sisters with a bright expression that the painter has caught with skill. The painting is in many ways a piece of formal court art. It is meant to be hung in a public room, to be seen by visiting dignitaries, to function as a dynastic statement about the next generation of the royal family. But Copley, who was a serious painter rather than a flattering one, has caught something genuine in the children's faces. Mary looks like a real older sister, impatient, proud. Sophia looks like a real middle child, quiet, watchful, contained. Amelia looks simply like a happy 2-year-old in a place she likes, with the people she loves. The painting is a surviving photograph from a moment that, by 1810, will already feel like a different world. If you ever find yourself at Buckingham Palace, or at one of the touring exhibitions of the Royal Collection, and you see the Copley portrait of the 3 youngest princesses, look at the face of Amelia at the bottom of the composition. That is the child who, 2.5 decades from now, will lie dying at Augusta Lodge while her father, in the next set of rooms, descends into the illness from which he will never recover. That is the face that will, in the king's last delusional years, populate the imaginary conversations he will hold with the dead daughter he believes is alive in Hanover. The painting was made in 1785. The world it shows had perhaps 3 more years to run before it began to break. I want to walk you briefly through what the daily life of a royal princess looked like in the late 1780s, because the routines were and they shaped Amelia's early experience of the world. The day at Windsor or at Kew began, for the youngest children, around 6 in the morning. The senior nurse would wake the children gently, dress them, and bring them down for a simple breakfast in the nursery bread and milk, perhaps with a piece of fruit. After breakfast there were lessons. Even at the age of 3 or 4, Amelia would have begun the formal education that the period considered appropriate. There was a writing master who came in twice a week to teach the children their letters. There was a music master, actually several, because the Queen, who was musically literate herself, considered music a serious part of any child's education, who came in to give the older children their instrumental lessons, with the smallest children sitting in the back of the room and absorbing what they could. There was a dancing master, who came in once a week to teach the children the formal steps that the period required for any future participation in court life. There was, as the children grew older, a French master and a German master, because the family was fluent in both languages, and the children were expected to be fluent too. The morning lessons usually took 2 or 3 hours. After lessons, there was a short period of free time in the nursery or in the gardens, weather permitting. Amelia, by her 3rd year, was an active child, and she liked to be outside running on the lawns at Kew, chasing the fallen leaves, picking the dandelions that grew along the gravel paths. The dog in the Copley portrait, a white spaniel called Frisk, was her companion in these morning walks, and she had, by the age of 3, formed the deep attachment to the dog that children form to the animals of their early childhood. Frisk would die of old age in the early 1790s. Amelia, then 9 or 10 years old, would weep for 2 days. The replacement dog, a smaller spaniel called Grouch, would never quite occupy the place Frisk had occupied. I want to spend a moment on the music lessons in particular, because music was, more than any of the other subjects of the schoolroom, the one that Amelia took to with real enthusiasm, and that became, in her short adult life, one of her central pleasures. The principal music master was a man named Charles Burney, the period's most distinguished musical scholar, who came in twice a week to give lessons to the older children and to supervise the basic instruction of the younger ones. Burney was a serious figure in the musical life of the age, the author of a 4-volume general history of music, the father of the novelist Fanny Burney, an acquaintance of Mozart and Haydn and most of the leading composers of the day. He was not, by the standards of fashionable London, a flamboyant teacher. He was thorough, careful, and demanding. He expected his royal pupils to practice. He marked their progress carefully. He reported regularly to the Queen on which children were applying themselves and which were not. Amelia, by the age of 5 or 6, had been picked out by Burney as a child of unusual musical promise. She had a clear ear. She could sing in tune from very early. She showed in her first lessons on the clavichord that the youngest children used, the instinctive musicality that good teachers spot immediately. By the age of 7, she had progressed to the harpsichord. By the age of 9, she had moved to the harp, which would remain her favourite instrument for the rest of her life. The harp was the period's quintessential instrument for ladies of rank. Beautiful to play, beautiful to look at, capable of considerable musical sophistication in the hands of a skilled player. Amelia, by her teens, was a skilled player. She could hold an audience with a harp recital of perhaps half an hour, with the technique that years of patient instruction had given her. The dancing lessons were also serious. The dancing master was a man named Pierre Gardel, brought over from Paris in the late 1780s to teach the royal children the formal court dances that the period required. The lessons took place in a long, high-ceilinged room on the first floor of the Queen's house, with the windows open in summer and the fire lit in winter, with one of the under-tutors playing the formal pieces on the harpsichord while the children went through the steps. Amelia, by her teens, was an accomplished dancer. She could, with the precision that the period required, manage the formal court minuet, the country dances, the early waltz that was just beginning to be acceptable in respectable households. She danced in the family musical evenings of her late teens, with her sisters and brothers, with the visiting officers of her father's household, with the set of approved family acquaintances who attended the household functions. The king, who was himself a serious amateur musician, he played the harpsichord and the flute, and he was a great admirer of Handel, encouraged the children's musical education actively. He attended their lessons sometimes. He corrected their hand position on the keyboard. He stood behind them while they played and turned the pages of their music for them. He had, in the way of an amateur musician with serious tastes, a real working knowledge of the music his children were learning, and his comments on their playing were the comments of a man who actually knew what he was talking about. There is a contemporary observation that captures something of his manner with the children at the keyboard. One of the household attendants, in a private letter to a friend, described the king coming into the music room one afternoon, while Amelia, then 6 years old, was practicing a piece by Mozart on the clavichord. The king, the attendant wrote, sat down on the bench beside her and listened to her play through the piece. When she had finished, he asked her to play it again, but to stress a note in the second bar that she had been treating too lightly. She played it again, with the adjustment. He nodded. He said, "That is better, Emily. That is what the composer meant." He patted her on the head. He left. The attendant, watching from the doorway, was struck by the texture of the exchange. Not the king teaching his daughter, but a serious amateur musician giving another musician a technical note, with the additional fact that the second musician was 6 years old and was in private his favourite child. Lunch was at noon, in the nursery served by the under-nurses. The food was the simple food that the period considered suitable for children: boiled meat, vegetables from the kitchen garden, bread, a portion of milk pudding for dessert. The king, on the days when he was at Windsor or at Kew, sometimes came up to the nursery for the children's lunch, and ate with them at the low table by the window. The Queen, who was less inclined to spend extended time in the nursery, came up less often. The afternoon was for less formal pursuits. There would be a longer walk, sometimes with one of the parents, more often with the senior nurse and one or two of the under-nurses. The walk would be in the gardens at Kew, when the family was there, or in the great park at Windsor. Amelia, by her 4th year, knew every path in the gardens of both estates, and could, by her 6th, have walked you through them blindfolded. The walks ended, usually, with a return to the nursery for tea. After tea, more free time drawing, music practice for the older children, story time for the youngest. Around 5 o'clock, the children were brought down to the formal apartments to spend an hour with the king and queen. This was the ritual of family life that the king had introduced, and that he was by 1788 deeply attached to. The children would come into the drawing room. They would make their formal bows and curtsies. They would speak to their parents about their lessons, their walks, their concerns. The king would tease them gently. The queen would ask serious questions about their behaviour. The hour would pass quickly, as the family ritual was designed to pass, and the children would be taken back upstairs for supper and bed. This was the life of Amelia in her first 5 years. It was by every measure that survives a happy one. She was loved. She was attended to. She was secure. She had in her father a person who was unmistakably and reliably devoted to her, and in her sisters Mary and Sophia, 2 close older companions who would remain her closest emotional companions for the whole of her life. It was also, although none of them knew it at the time, the most uncomplicated stretch of her childhood. After 1788, nothing in the family would ever be quite the same again. In June of 1788, when Amelia was 4 years old, the king fell ill. The illness, when it began, did not look like what it would become. The king, in the early summer of 1788, complained of stomach pains, of headaches, of difficulty sleeping. The household physicians attributed the symptoms to overwork, to the heat, to the accumulated stresses of his role. The king himself was inclined to dismiss them. He had always been physically robust. He thought of himself as constitutionally healthy. He carried on with his duties. By the autumn, however, the illness had developed into something stranger and more serious. The king began to show signs of confusion. He spoke rapidly, with the words tumbling over each other, on subjects he had not been asked about. He slept very little. He became agitated by things that would not have agitated him a year earlier. The Queen, who was in daily contact with him, was alarmed. The Prince of Wales, who lived separately but was kept informed of the king's condition by the household physicians, was also alarmed, although in his case the alarm was mixed with the private speculation about whether his father's illness might lead, eventually, to his own assumption of the throne. By November, the king was no longer able to perform his constitutional functions. He was by every observable measure suffering from a serious mental disturbance. The exact diagnosis has been debated for 2 centuries. The leading modern interpretations suggest some combination of bipolar disorder or, in an older proposal, the metabolic disorder porphyria. The truth may never be entirely settled. What the contemporary record shows is a king who, in the autumn and winter of 1788, was not himself, and whose family was, for the first time, confronted with the possibility that he might never be himself again. The treatment, as the period applied it, was harsh. The medicine of the late 18th century did not have the diagnostic tools or the therapeutic options that we have now. The doctors who attended the king tried what they knew. He was confined. He was, at the worst stretches, restrained. The household, which had been built around the king's presence, was reorganized around his absence and around the sad work of caring for a man who was not, in any practical sense, the man they had known. Amelia, 4 years old, did not understand any of this directly. She was kept away from her father during the worst of the illness, on the medical advice of the physicians and the explicit instructions of the Queen. The decision was that the children, and especially the youngest, who had been the king's favourites, should not see him in his current state. The damage of the visual memory, the household reasoned, would be greater than the comfort of the visit, but she felt the absence. She had been for the whole of her 4 years in daily contact with her father. The afternoon visit to the drawing room, the walks in the garden, the moments when the king came up to the nursery and dropped to the carpet beside her, all of that, in the autumn of 1788, simply stopped. Her father, who had been the reliable centre of her world, was, from her perspective, suddenly gone. He had not died. The household was clear about that. He was ill. He would, the household hoped, recover, but he was not present. He was somewhere else in the house, somewhere she was not allowed to go, and the days of her life proceeded without him. She was 4. She did not have the conceptual machinery to process what was happening. What she did was what very children always do when something they cannot understand happens to them. She became more clinging, more anxious, more attached to the people who were still present. Her sister Mary, who was 12 at this point, became the figure she sought out. Her sister Sophia, 11, was also frequently with her. The Queen was preoccupied with the king's care and was less available than usual. Amelia attached more deeply to her sisters in this period than she had been before, and the deepening would last her whole life. The bond between Amelia and Mary in particular, which had been the ordinary affection of 2 sisters, became, in the long, anxious autumn of 1788, a version of bond that survives every later difficulty. Mary would be the sister who, 22 years from this autumn, would nurse Amelia through her final illness. The pattern of that future devotion was being laid down now in the daily details of an autumn in which 2 sisters held each other through the absence of their father. I want you to picture for a moment the texture of those autumn evenings. The nursery at Kew, where the family had moved in late November on the medical advice of the physicians, Kew being smaller, quieter, less filled with the public reminders of the king's state than Windsor. The fire in the grate, the single candle burning on the table by the window. Mary, 12, sitting on the floor with Amelia, 4, on her lap, telling her some story she has half made up to keep her younger sister settled. Sophia at the table by the wall, working on a piece of needlework with the concentration of a child trying to occupy herself. The senior nurse in her chair by the fire watching them, with her own face composed, but her own eyes occasionally going to the window where the dark winter rain is falling on the lawns of Kew. Somewhere in the next building, in the set of rooms where the king is being kept, the distant sound of a door closing, or a voice raised, or one of the physicians passing in the corridor, the 4-year-old in her older sister's lap, listening to the story, with her hand curled into Mary's, the whole evening built around the absence of the man who would normally have been there, and who on this night in November of 1788 was not the king recovered partially in the spring of 1789. By February, he was visibly improving. By April, he was well enough to resume some of his duties. By the summer, he was effectively back to his pre-illness self. The country, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. There was a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's. The Prince of Wales, who had been actively manoeuvring for a regency during the worst of the illness, retreated, somewhat embarrassed, to his ordinary life. But the family had been changed. The king had been ill. He could be ill again. The confidence that had sustained the family routines, the assumption that the king was reliably present, reliably engaged, reliably available for the afternoon visit and the nursery floor, was gone. From 1789 onward, the family lived with the underlying knowledge that the illness might return. The Queen, who was the figure most affected by the experience, became progressively more anxious about the king's well-being and progressively more controlling about anything she thought might trigger another episode. The children, the older daughters in particular, watched their mother's anxiety carefully and adjusted their own behaviour around it. Amelia, by the time the king recovered in the spring of 1789, was 5 years old. She had, in the long autumn and winter, learned a new emotional vocabulary that the previous 4 years had not required. She had learned about absence. She had learned about anxiety. She did not yet know. None of them yet knew that the illness would come back in 1801, in 1804, and most catastrophically in 1810, the year of her own death. But the pattern of her relationship with her father's illness, which would recur and deepen over the next 2 decades, was laid down in this first episode, when she was 4 and 5 years old, in the autumn and winter of 1788 and 1789. We move forward now into Amelia's adolescence and her late teens, the years from roughly 1796 to 1803. She is in this stretch a young woman in her teens and very early 20s, and her life is shaped, more than anything else, by the imprisonment that her father's recurring illness has imposed on her and her sisters. The arrangement by the late 1790s has acquired a name among the daughters themselves. They call it, half jokingly and half seriously, the nunnery. The nunnery is not a building. It is the situation in which the 6 adult daughters of George III now find themselves. Charlotte, the Princess Royal, the eldest, is in her early 30s by 1800. Elizabeth is in her late 20s. Mary is in her early 20s. Amelia, the youngest, is 17 at the turn of the new century. None of them is married. They live, all 6 of them, with their parents, in the apartments of the Queen's House in London, or in the lodges around Windsor, or in the Dutch house at Kew, with their movements, their friendships, and their possible romantic attachments closely supervised by their mother. Why? The reasons are several, and they are tangled. First, the king's illness. The episodes of 1788 and 1801, and the smaller troubles in between, have made the Queen extremely anxious about anything that might disturb the king's mental state. The marriage of any of his daughters to a foreign prince, which would mean the daughter leaving England and going to live abroad, was, the Queen feared, exactly the character of event that might tip the king into another episode. The king himself, when his daughters were younger, had made gestures toward the eventual matter of finding them husbands, but had also said, in his more honest moments, that he could not bear the thought of separation from any of them. As the years passed and the illness recurred, the question of marriage simply became impossible to raise. Second, the Queen's own preferences. The Queen, for reasons of her own, her anxiety, her loneliness, her need for the presence of her daughters, in the difficult care of her ill husband, wanted them to remain close. She had lost 2 sons in infancy. She had lost a son to early adulthood and dissipation in the form of the Prince of Wales, whose behaviour she found mortifying. She had in her unmarried daughters the cohort of female companions who could be relied on to be there. She did not want to give them up. Third, the wider political situation. The wars with France, which began in 1793 and continued for most of the next 2 decades, made marriage to a foreign prince extremely complicated. The available princes, the German princes, the Dutch princes, the various minor Italian and Scandinavian princes, were either at war with Britain, allied with France, or politically inappropriate for other reasons. The traditional channels for arranging royal marriages were closed. The princesses, even if their parents had been inclined to marry them off, would have had a very narrow set of acceptable suitors. The result, by the year 1800, is the situation that the daughters call the nunnery. They live with their parents. They go where their parents go. They eat at their parents' table. They walk in their parents' gardens. They attend the family events that make up the household calendar. They have very few opportunities to meet eligible men of their own age. The men they do meet, the equerries who attend their father, the senior household officials, the visiting officers and diplomats, are watched closely by the Queen for any sign of inappropriate attachment. If a princess shows interest in a man, the man is, in most cases, quietly removed from any further opportunity to encounter her. The princesses, watching this happen over and over, learn to keep their attachments private. I want you to picture the daily life of the nunnery in, say, the spring of 1801. The principal residence is the Queen's House in central London, the building that will eventually become Buckingham Palace, but is still in 1801 a comparatively modest royal residence in its old form. The princesses occupy a suite of rooms on the upper floors, looking south throughout the gardens at the back of the house toward the ornamental water features that the Queen has had installed. The day begins at 7 in the morning, when the maids come in to draw the curtains and lay the fires in the grates. The princesses dress with the help of their personal attendants. They wear, in the morning, the simple high-waisted muslin gowns that the period favoured for indoor wear pale colours, embroidered hems, lace caps for those who chose to wear them. They go down to the breakfast room on the first floor, where they take a light breakfast with their mother. The king is usually elsewhere, at his levee, at his correspondence, at the official duties of the morning, and breakfast is, in the ordinary working day of the household, a women's meal. After breakfast comes the work of the morning. The princesses retire to their own sitting room, the pink drawing room, where they spend the next several hours at their various pursuits. There is Drawing Mary is serious about her drawing, and works at it for an hour or two every morning, with a portfolio of watercolour studies of plants and birds and the ornamental subjects from the period. There is Music Amelia, who plays the harp, practices for an hour or so daily on the instrument that is kept in the corner of the room. There is Reading, the period preferred for ladies of their rank, the moral works of writers like Hannah More and Maria Edgeworth, with the occasional novel of Burney or Edgeworth admitted as a concession to entertainment. There is needlework embroidery in particular, where the princesses are working jointly on a long screen for one of the rooms at Windsor that will, when finished, take them several years to complete. There is correspondence. Each of the princesses writes letters daily to their absent siblings and to the set of approved female correspondents that the Queen has authorised them to maintain. At noon they take a light luncheon. After luncheon they walk in the gardens of the Queen's house, weather permitting. The gardens, by 1801, are extensive, perhaps 30 acres in the centre of London, the largest private garden in the city, with mature trees and ornamental walks and a lake at the far end. The princesses walk, in pairs or in trios, along the gravel paths, attended by one or two of their ladies and a footman who stays at a discreet distance. They are allowed to walk for perhaps an hour. They are not allowed to leave the gardens. The afternoon is for more of the same drawing, reading, music, until the daily ritual of the family gathering at 5 o'clock, when the princesses come down to the formal drawing room to spend an hour with their parents. The conversation is the conversation of long family habit, the news of the day, the reports from the older brothers, the comments on the household routines, the avoidance of any subject that might disturb the king. After the family hour, the princesses dress for dinner, which is taken at 6 in the evening en famille, in the dining room rather than the state dining room. After dinner there is sometimes a musical evening with one of the princesses playing for the family. By 10 or 11 the household is in bed. This is the life of an adult daughter of George III in 1801. It is the life that the princesses, with various degrees of acceptance and resentment, lived for years on end. Charlotte the Princess Royal eventually escaped by marrying the King of Württemberg in 1797 and going to live in Germany. The other 5 remained through their late 20s and their 30s in the patterns of the household, with the long stretches of pursuit and the brief breaks for visits to Weymouth or Windsor or Frogmore. They aged in how human beings age, without the markers of marriage, motherhood, and independent household that women of their rank in any other family would have used to measure the passage of their lives. Amelia, by her late teens, is the youngest member of this strange household within a household. She is, by every contemporary account, lively, intelligent, musically gifted, and increasingly unhappy with her situation. She loves her parents. She is close to her father. She would never, in any direct way, complain about the household arrangement. But she watches her elder sisters in their late 20s and early 30s, still living in the parental apartments, still unmarried, still subject to the Queen's surveillance, and she sees with a clarity that her sisters have largely abandoned, that her own future is going to look exactly the same. She is not going to be married. She is not going to have her own household. She is going to live for the rest of her life in the apartments of her parents' residences, doing the ladylike pursuits drawing, music, embroidery, a little reading that the daughters of George III are permitted to do. She is 17. She is beautiful. She is healthy. She is, by every observation that survives, a young woman who would have, in any other family in the country, been at the centre of a social season with suitors and dances and the open prospect of a future. None of that is available to her. The nunnery, by 1800, is the framework of her whole adult life as she begins it. I want to take you, while she is in her late teens, to the place that was the great escape from the nunnery, the seaside town of Weymouth, on the south coast of England. The king had begun visiting Weymouth in 1789, in the convalescent period following his first major illness. He had liked it. The Dorset town, with its long arc of pale sandy beach and its sheltered bay, became the family's preferred summer destination through the 1790s and into the early 1800s. The royal household took over a substantial residence called Augusta Lodge on the seafront. The whole family went down for several weeks at a time. The local people, who initially treated the royal visits as a remarkable event, gradually became accustomed to them. The king walked along the esplanade in the mornings. The princesses, including Amelia, took the sea bathing that was considered, at the time, to be one of the great medical treatments for any constitutional weakness. Picture Weymouth on a July morning in 1798. Amelia is 14. She is staying at Augusta Lodge with the rest of the family. The morning has dawned clear and cool, with a breeze off the sea and a few high white clouds moving slowly in the pale blue sky. The bay, when she looks out of her bedroom window, is the deep, clean blue-green that the English Channel produces on a calm summer morning, with the white-tipped waves catching the early sun and the fishing boats out beyond the harbour mouth riding gently on the swell. The smell of the sea salt, fresh, mineral, with the faint note of seaweed from the rocks at the south end of the bay, comes in through the open window on the breeze. The gulls are calling overhead in the high cries that they make at sunrise. She dresses with the help of one of her ladies. The dress is the simple white morning gown that the period used for ladies of her age and rank high-waisted, in the slim Regency line that is just beginning to come into fashion, with puff sleeves and a low square neckline. She puts on a wide straw bonnet with a blue ribbon. She picks up the bag containing her bathing things, a flannel bathing dress, a towel, a brush for her hair afterward. She goes downstairs to meet her sisters and the party of attendants who will accompany them to the beach. The walk from Augusta Lodge to the beach is perhaps 200 yards along the esplanade that runs the length of the bay. The esplanade is the long pavement that the town has built along the seafront, with iron railings on the seaward side and wooden benches at intervals. Even at this early hour, perhaps 8 in the morning, there are people about. The fishermen are coming back into the harbour with the night's catch. The local shopkeepers are opening their doors and laying out their wares. The early walkers are taking their morning constitutional along the esplanade. They see the royal party approaching, and they bow or curtsy as the princesses pass. And the princesses, well trained in the public courtesies, smile and nod in return. I want to spend a moment on the sea bathing, because it is one of the cultural practices of the late Georgian period that the modern reader sometimes finds difficult to picture, and because it was a major part of Amelia's life from her early teens onward. The bathing was not what the modern reader thinks of as bathing. The princesses did not have swimming costumes. They did not float on the water for pleasure. The whole thing was conducted as a medical procedure in a portable building called a bathing machine. The bathing machine was a wooden hut, perhaps 8 feet long, on 4 large wheels with a door at each end and a window high up. It was kept on the beach. When a lady wished to bathe, she went into the bathing machine through the door on the landward side. Inside the machine, with the door closed behind her, she changed out of her ordinary clothes and into the bathing dress, a long flannel garment that covered her from neck to ankle, with sleeves to the wrist, designed to preserve modesty in the water. While she was changing, the machine was drawn into the sea by a horse, with the wheels going deeper into the water, until the seaward door, the door at the far end, was about waist deep in the surf. The horse was then unhitched and walked back to the beach. The lady, having finished changing, opened the seaward door, descended a set of wooden steps, and entered the water, with the bulk of the bathing machine itself screening her from any onlookers on the beach. She was assisted in the water by a professional bather, a strong local woman called the Dipper, whose job was to hold the lady firmly, plunge her 3 times under the cold seawater, and then help her back up the steps into the machine. The plunging was the medical part. The cold water was thought to invigorate the constitution, to balance the humours, to drive out whatever was causing the patient's weakness. The whole procedure took perhaps 15 minutes. The lady would change back into her dry clothes inside the machine. The horse would be rehitched, the machine would be drawn back up the beach, and she would emerge through the landward door, refreshed by the experience, ready to walk back to her lodgings for breakfast. This was sea bathing in 1800. Amelia, from the age of about 10 or 11, did it almost every morning when the family was at Weymouth. She found it bracing. She found it pleasurable. The morning routine of the bathing machine, the descent into the cold sea water, the plunge, the return to the interior of the machine, was by her early teens one of the physical pleasures of her summers. The cold of the water when one descended into it was by every contemporary account intense. The English Channel in July, even on the warmest days, is around 16 or 17 degrees Celsius, cold enough to take the breath away on first immersion, but not, for a healthy young person, dangerous. The plunge when the dipper pushed Amelia under was a single brief shock to the body. The cold against the face, the rush of water in the ears, the panic of the lungs at the moment of full submersion, the immediate gasp emergence, 3 plunges with brief intervals between them, then the climb up the wooden steps back into the machine, the towel dry and warm waiting for her, the brisk rub down, the change back into ordinary clothes. The whole experience was, in its way, a ritual of brief shock and recovery, and the recovery, the warming, the drying, the return to the morning was, by Amelia's report, the part she liked best. There is one incident at Weymouth that I want to mention, because it captures something about the daily indignities that even the king's daughters had to manage. In the summer of 1800, when Amelia was 16, she went to her bathing machine one morning to find 2 men inside it. The men, presumably some local intruders, had crept into the machine on the beach overnight and had stayed there. They refused to leave. The proprietor of the bathing machines, alerted by the princess's attendants, eventually had to drive the machine into the sea, with the men still inside, until they were forced to scramble out into the waves. The defeated men, soaked and embarrassed, were jeered by the crowd that had gathered on the beach. The princess, by every contemporary account, was not distressed by the incident. She had, by 16, the stoic patience that her position required. She bathed in a different machine that morning. The story circulated quickly through the town, and by the next day was already a comic local anecdote. By the end of the season, it had been included in one of the satirical newspapers in London. The detail tells you something. Amelia, at 16, was already a public figure of a kind. Her movements were watched. Incidents involving her were reported. She did not have, even at the seaside, the private freedom that an ordinary young woman of her age might have had. She was, even when she was simply trying to bathe in the morning, a princess, with all the constraints that the role imposed. The principal companions of Amelia's adolescence, throughout this period, were her 2 next eldest sisters, Mary and Sophia. The 3 of them, Mary, Sophia, and Amelia, were the 3 youngest daughters of the king, and they had grown up together in the nursery, taken their lessons together, walked the gardens together, and now, in their late teens and 20s, formed an inseparable trio at the heart of the family. Mary, by 1800, was 24. She was the steadiest of the 3, the quietest, the most patient. She was not, by the period standards, the most beautiful of the sisters. Amelia and Sophia were both considered prettier, but she had a calm warmth that made her, throughout the family, the sister whom everyone went to in difficulty. She was a letter writer, with the intelligent observation that good correspondents always have, and her letters to her brothers, to George, the Prince of Wales, survive in considerable numbers and provide one of the best inside views we have of the family in this period. She was Amelia's favourite among her sisters. The 2 of them, although 7 years apart in age, had formed in childhood the deep intuitive sympathy that some sisters form, and that once formed is the central emotional fact of both their lives. Sophia, in 1800, was 23. She was the more vivacious of the 3, the more outwardly emotional, the more given to scenes and dramas. She was beautiful, in the delicate way that the period preferred. She had her own private complications. She was, by the late 1790s, secretly in love with one of the equerries of her father's household, a man named Thomas Garth, and the complications of that relationship would haunt her for the rest of her life. We will not dwell on Sophia's story tonight, because it is not Amelia's story, but the parallel of Sophia's secret romantic life and the secret romantic life that Amelia herself would develop in the early 1800s is one of the repeating patterns of the household. Both of the younger princesses, in the absence of any acceptable formal marriage, found themselves attaching to men they could not openly marry. Both of them, in different ways, paid for the attachments. The three sisters, in the social world of the household, were a unit. They walked together, they sat together at family meals, they worked at their drawings and their music together in the sitting room they shared in the Queen's apartments at the Queen's House in London. They went together on the carriage drives in the parks. They took the sea air together at Weymouth. The bond between them was the bond of three young women who had grown up together and who, in the bounded world of the nunnery, had only each other for the shape of intimate daily companionship that they could not, by the conventions of their position, find anywhere else. I want you to picture them in their shared sitting room on a winter afternoon in 1801, the pink drawing room on the upper floor of the Queen's house, with the long windows looking out over the gardens at the back of the building. The room takes its name from the pink silk that covers the walls in long panels framed by gilt mouldings. There are 3 chairs drawn up around a round table near the window, where the sisters work in the afternoon light. There is a fire burning in the grate at the far end of the room, with a fire screen of embroidered silk in front of it to soften the heat. There is a harp in the corner, Amelia's harp, a beautiful instrument with a gilded frame and pale soundboard, the strings catching the light when the curtains are drawn back. There are books on the side tables. There are work baskets beside the chairs. There is a writing desk against the wall opposite the window. Mary, 25 years old, is at the round table working on a watercolour study of a bouquet of dried flowers that one of the under-gardeners has brought up from the gardens. She has set the bouquet in a glass vase in front of her. She is working carefully with a brush, her face concentrated, her hand steady. She is wearing a grey day dress with a lace collar. Sophia, 24, is at the writing desk against the wall, working through her morning correspondence. She has 6 letters spread out on the desk, in various stages of completion. She is wearing a pale blue dress with white trim. She writes quickly, with the impatient energy that her sisters have come to associate with her, the words tumbling onto the paper, the scratchy sound of the goose quill against the cream paper, the occasional sigh when she has to stop and reread something to find her place. Amelia, 18, is on a chaise longue near the harp reading. The book in her hands is one of the novels of Maria Edgeworth Belinda, perhaps, which has just been published, and she is, by the expression on her face, enjoying it. She reads in the absorbed way of a young woman who has for the moment escaped into another world and does not want to come back. The afternoon goes on. The light through the long windows shifts gradually from the pale clear light of midday to the warmer gold of late afternoon. The fire in the grate crackles softly. One of the maids comes in at 3 o'clock with a tray of tea things, a teapot, 3 cups, a plate of biscuits, a dish of preserved fruit, and sets it on the table by the chaise longue. The sisters break their work to take their tea. They talk in the way of 3 sisters who have spent the whole of their lives together, comments on the day, teasing private references that no one else in the household would understand. They laugh, occasionally. They are, in this room, on this winter afternoon, in their late teens and early 20s, almost happy. This was the surviving good thing of the nunnery. The sisters had each other. The bond they had formed in childhood had deepened in adolescence, and was now, in their 20s, the central emotional fact of all three of their lives. They were not free. They had no prospect of becoming free, but they were, in the daily arrangement of their afternoons in the pink drawing room or the saloon at Windsor, or the upstairs sitting room at Augusta Lodge in Weymouth, surrounded by the sustaining presence of two other women who knew them completely and who were entirely on their side. It was, in the long way that such things are, enough to make life bearable. Amelia, by her late teens, had developed within this trio the character that would mark her for the rest of her short life. She was musical. She played the harp seriously, with considerable skill, and she had a clear singing voice that she used in the family musical evenings that the Queen still arranged occasionally at Windsor. She drew. She read. She wrote letters. She had, by every account, a quick and sharp wit, with a tendency to comic observations of the people around her that made her sisters laugh, and that occasionally got her into trouble with her mother. She was, in her late teens, a young woman of considerable charm and considerable intelligence, in a household that had no real use for either. The first signs of the illness that would eventually take her appeared in the late 1790s. They were small, at first, and easily dismissed. Amelia was, by her mid-teens, prone to what the period called consumptive symptoms. She had, periodically, episodes of coughing that did not entirely clear. She tired more easily than her sisters in the long walks of the family routine. She was thin-slighter, in her bone structure, than the rather sturdier Mary and Sophia. The household physicians, who had been monitoring her health since infancy, noted these tendencies in the records they kept, but did not consider them, at this stage, serious. Many young women belonging to that world had similar constitutional weaknesses. The treatment, when treatment was applied, was the standard period mixture of country air, sea bathing, mild walking, and the avoidance of anything that might tax the constitution. In the spring of 1798, when she was 14, Amelia had a more serious episode. She fell ill with what the household physicians described, in the language from that era, as a feverish complaint. She was confined to her bed for several weeks. She recovered, but slowly. She was not entirely well for the rest of that year. By the spring of 1799, she was declared to be in a state of convalescence, and the Queen, pleased to have her youngest daughter restored, arranged a formal entertainment at Frogmore, the house on the Windsor estate that was the Queen's retreat, on the 8th of March 1799 to celebrate the recovery. But the recovery was not complete. By the summer of 1799, Amelia was again unwell. She went to Weymouth with the family, but she was not strong enough to walk on the esplanade with her sisters. She stayed in Augusta Lodge, the family residence, playing music and entertaining her young niece Princess Charlotte, the only daughter of the Prince of Wales, who was at this point 3 years old and at Weymouth with the family, and making handmade gifts for her sisters. The illness, although the household physicians did not yet have a clear name for it, was the early stage of what would, by her early 20s, be diagnosable as pulmonary tuberculosis. It was the disease that, in the early 19th century, killed an enormous number of young women of Amelia's class and age. It was slow. It was progressive. It had periods of apparent improvement and periods of sharp decline. It was, in the medical resources of its time, fundamentally untreatable. The doctors who attended her could prescribe rest, country air, sea bathing, and various tonic preparations, They could not, in any meaningful sense, the progress of the disease. Amelia did not, in 1799, know what was wrong with her. The household physicians did not entirely know either. What was clear, by the turn of the new century, was that the king's youngest daughter, the favourite child, the bright centre of the family's afternoon affections, was not well. She would have periods of relative health for the next several years. She would, in some of those periods, look almost like the young woman she had been at 15. But the underlying trajectory from the late 1790s onward was downward. She was not getting better. The next decade of her life would be lived in the acceptance of that fact. It was into this stretch of fragile health and shadowed prospects that Charles Fitzroy, in the early 1800s, walked into her life, and the great private love affair of her short adulthood began. The love affair of Princess Amelia and Charles Fitzroy is one of the most documented and least visible romantic stories of the Regency period. It was conducted, for the whole of its course, in private. It produced an enormous body of letters which were, for nearly 2 centuries, sealed in the royal archives and only released to scholars in the last few years. It was known about, during their own lifetimes, by a group of family members and household intimates, but was carefully concealed from the public, and was never in the legal sense the period required, formalized into anything more than the private commitment between 2 people who could not openly act on it. I want to walk you through the story slowly, because it is the great hidden chapter of Amelia's short life, and because it shapes everything about the long, sad final years of her illness. Charles Fitzroy was an officer in the king's household. He held the position of equerry, a senior personal attendant to the king, responsible for arranging his daily schedule, accompanying him on his rides, attending him at his levees, and managing the requirements of the king's working life. The position of equerry was traditionally given to officers of the army or the navy, who were considered gentlemen of suitable rank to be in close personal service to the monarch. Fitzroy fitted the requirements. He was a serving army officer, a colonel by the early 1800s, eventually rising to general. He was the great-great-grandson of King Charles II through one of the king's illegitimate children. He was, in the technical genealogical sense, distantly related to the royal family. He was, in the practical sense, a senior attendant who saw the king daily, and who was therefore, by virtue of his role, in continuous close contact with the rest of the royal household. He was 21 years older than Amelia. By the time of their first acquaintance, in the late 1790s, he was already in his late 30s, a serving officer of considerable experience, unmarried by every account, and dignified man. He was not, by the standards then, a distinguished romantic figure. He was not handsome in the dramatic sense. He was not wealthy. He was not titled. He was simply a senior officer in the king's household, doing a senior officer's work with the calm manner that the work required. I want to spend a moment on what kind of man Fitzroy actually was, because the surviving record allows us to put together a reasonably clear picture, and because his character explains something about why a young woman in Amelia's position would have attached to him so deeply. He was, by every contemporary account, a man. He was not a wit. He was not a storyteller. He did not, in the ordinary registers of court society, command attention. The contemporary diarists who mention him, Henry Holford in his medical notes, Glenbervie in his diaries, the various journal keepers of the Regency household, describe him in the terms reserved for men who do not project themselves: steady, reliable, gentlemanly, well-meaning. He was, the consensus suggested, the sort of senior officer the household needed, but not the type of man one noticed in a crowded room. He was an experienced soldier. He had served in the army since his late teens. He had been on active service in Flanders in the 1790s. He had, by the early 1800s, the long technical knowledge of military matters that comes from 20 years of practice, and he was, in his own professional sphere, well regarded. He would, by the end of his career, reach the rank of full general. He took his work seriously. He was not, in the period's term, a fashionable officer who used his commission for social advantage. He was a working soldier who had built his career through patient competence. He was, in his personal manners, careful. He spoke quietly. He listened more than he talked. He was, by every account, scrupulously polite to women. He had in particular the unfailing attentiveness to the comforts of others, the offering of a chair, the carrying of a parcel, the adjustment of a window blind, that the period considered the mark of a genuine gentleman. He had not married in his 30s for reasons that the record does not entirely make clear. There was no scandal attached to his bachelorhood. He simply had not, by the time he met Amelia, found a woman he wanted to marry. He was, in how mattered most to Amelia, capable of a long attention. The relationship for both of them required years of patient continuity. There were stretches of months when they could not communicate. There were stretches of years when the relationship had to be conducted entirely through letters. He provided, throughout, the presence that the situation demanded. He did not, by any record, ever falter. He did not press for resolution. He did not threaten to walk away. He simply, in the patient way that his character permitted, kept up the relationship that they had constructed, and let her set the pace. This was, for a young woman of Amelia's temperament, quick, witty, occasionally dramatic, with the underlying anxiety of long illness, exactly the right kind of man. She did not need a man who would match her in vivacity. Fitzroy steadied her. The relationship, whatever its other limitations, gave her in him the reliable centre that the rest of her life, with its illnesses, its family difficulties, its impossible structural constraints, did not provide. When and exactly how they fell in love is not entirely clear from the surviving record. The probable timing is around 1801 or 1802, when Amelia was 18 or 19. They had been in regular contact for years, given the structure of the household, but the relationship between a princess and a senior equerry would normally have remained in the formal register of court interaction. Something, in the way of these things, shifted. By 1803, the Queen was writing to Amelia in a form of guarded, reproachful tone that mothers use when they have detected an inappropriate attachment in a daughter. She referred repeatedly in her letters to this unpleasant business, and urged Amelia to break off whatever it was that had begun. Amelia did not break it off. She concealed it more carefully. By 1804, when she was 20, she had begun signing letters to her sisters and her brothers with the initials AFR. The initials stood for Amelia Fitzroy. She considered herself, in her own private interpretation of the situation, to be in some meaningful sense Fitzroy's wife. She told her brother Frederick, the Duke of York, in a letter that survives, that she considered herself married already. She signed her letters to Fitzroy himself as his affectionate and devoted wife and darling. This was, of course, a private fiction. There was no marriage in any legal sense. There could not be. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, passed by her grandfather King George II's Parliament, actually by her father's Parliament in 1772, in response to two earlier scandals involving the king's brothers, required that any marriage of a member of the royal family under the age of 25 be approved by the king himself, and that any marriage even after the age of 25 be approved by the king or, in the absence of his approval, by both houses of Parliament. The act had been passed specifically to prevent a version of marriage that Amelia and Fitzroy were imagining. It was, from her perspective, the immovable legal fact that closed the door on any open future for the relationship. Her father would never have approved the marriage. She knew this. Fitzroy was a commoner, a senior officer, a respectable man, but he was not a prince. He was not even a peer. He was 21 years older than her. The marriage, if it had been proposed openly, would have been refused immediately by the king, and would have caused in the household the character of crisis that the Queen had been trying for years to avoid. So the marriage was conducted, in Amelia's mind, as a private spiritual matter. She said the words to herself. She signed the initials. She wrote the letters. She kept Fitzroy's miniature portrait in a locket she wore. She arranged when she could for them to be in the same room at family events, at public functions, at the moments when his role as equerry brought him into proximity with her. They could not be alone together for any extended period. They could not openly converse about anything other than the formal matters that the household permitted. But they were, in the parallel reality that they had constructed for themselves, married. They were, in their own understanding, a couple. What did they talk about in the moments they had? The letters provide some answer. They talk about her health, which is in continuous fragile decline through this period. They talk about his work, which takes him away from court for stretches at a time on military duties. They talk about her family, the Queen, whom Amelia describes in increasingly bitter terms in her letters as the great obstacle to any future they might have. They talk about books they have both read. They talk about music. Amelia describes in one letter a piece of music she has just learned to play on the harp, and asks Fitzroy whether he remembers her playing the same piece for him at Weymouth 2 summers earlier. They talk in the way of any couple in any era about the daily texture of their separate lives, with the additional poignancy that the lives are running in parallel rather than together, and that the convergence into a single life that ordinary couples eventually achieve is closed to them. There is, in the letters, a note that is worth quoting briefly. In one letter to Fitzroy, written in the period just before her final illness, Amelia wrote, in language carefully calibrated for an audience that might one day open the letters, "Should my cruel situation continue to separate our persons, be assured my heart is, and long has been joined and united with yours. I live but for you. I love you with the purest affection, the greatest gratitude." The phrase "should my cruel situation continue to separate our persons" captures the emotional architecture of the relationship. The separation was understood by both of them as the cruelty of the situation. The love itself was, in their understanding, fixed and certain. What was painful was the inability to act on it, the inability to bring the two parallel lives together into a single shared one, the inability to live in the same house and walk the same gardens and have the daily companionship that any couple in any other circumstances would have had as a matter of course. I want you to picture for a moment the mechanics of how the secret correspondence actually worked, because the practical detail is part of what made the relationship sustainable over the years. Amelia wrote her letters to Fitzroy in her own private sitting room, on the days when she had the energy and the privacy. She used a portable writing desk that her father had given her on her 20th birthday, a beautifully made walnut box that opened into a slanted writing surface, with compartments inside for paper, ink, sand for blotting, sealing wax, and a set of seals. The desk could be set up on her lap or on a table by the window. She wrote on the sheets of pale cream writing paper that the household supplied, with the watermark of the royal stationer faintly visible in the fibres of the paper when held up to the light. She used iron-gall ink, in the shade of black blue that all letters of the age were written in, with a goose quill pen that she trimmed herself with an ivory-handled knife from her workbox. The letters, when finished, were folded carefully. The period did not generally use envelopes, but folded the letter itself into a packet with the address written on the outermost surface, and sealed with a drop of red sealing wax. She did not seal them with the royal cipher. She used a private seal, a simple oval with a flower design, that she had ordered specifically for this correspondence, and that was kept hidden in the bottom drawer of the writing desk. The letters were then conveyed to Fitzroy through a chain of trusted intermediaries. Sometimes one of her sisters carried them, sometimes a footman who had been quietly enlisted as a discreet courier. Sometimes, when Fitzroy was on military duty away from the household, they were sent through the regular post, addressed to a friend of Fitzroy's who would then pass them on, so that the letters never appeared in the official records of the postal service to be passing directly between the princess and the colonel. Fitzroy's letters back came by similar routes. Amelia kept them in a leather-bound box that she kept locked in the bottom of her writing desk. The key to the box hung on a silver chain that she wore around her neck, under her dress, where the Queen could not see it. She read the letters in private. She read some of them many times. The most important of them she had nearly memorized by the time of her death. When she died in 1810, the box of Fitzroy's letters passed, by the terms of her will, to him. He took it home. The letters returned to him, with the additional private weight of having been kept by her, read by her, and now finally returned to the writer. He kept them for the rest of his life. After his own death decades later, the letters eventually entered the royal archives, where they were sealed for nearly 2 centuries before becoming available to scholars in our own time. The Queen's opposition throughout this period was firm and continuous. Charlotte was, by every contemporary account, deeply opposed to the relationship from the moment she became aware of it. The opposition was not, in her own self-understanding, personal. She did not dislike Fitzroy. She acknowledged that he was a respectable man. The opposition was about the impossibility of the marriage. Charlotte understood, more clearly than her young daughter did, that the relationship had no legal future. She also understood, with the acid pragmatism that long marriage to George III had taught her, that any open scandal involving Amelia would push the king toward another episode of his illness. She was determined that no such scandal would happen on her watch. The mechanism by which Charlotte managed the situation was the surveillance of her household. She watched. She read the letters Amelia left around. She questioned her ladies-in-waiting about Amelia's movements. She arranged the household schedule in ways that minimized the opportunities for Amelia and Fitzroy to be in the same place. She wrote, repeatedly, the reproachful letters to Amelia that survive in the archives, urging her to give up this unpleasant business and to apply herself to the ladylike pursuits that the Queen considered appropriate. I want to spend a moment on the texture of the Queen's surveillance, because it shaped, more than anything else, the daily reality of Amelia's life through the long years of the relationship. The Queen had around her a network of senior ladies-in-waiting who had been with her for years, who were entirely loyal to her, and who reported to her on the doings of the princesses with the attention that long service had taught them. The chief of these was a woman named Lady Charlotte Finch, who had been the royal governess for years, and who had, by the early 1800s, transitioned into the role of a senior household confidant. There was also a dresser of the Queen's named Madame Beckerdorf, who had come over from Mecklenburg with the Queen in 1761, and who, by the 1800s, was one of the Queen's closest personal attendants. Between them, these women monitored the comings and goings of the household with the attention of professional observers. They knew which letters arrived for Amelia. They knew which visitors she received. They knew in the details of dress and manner that experienced women from the period could read with great accuracy, when she was in low spirits and when she was cheerful. The information was passed to the Queen in the daily conferences that the Queen held with her senior ladies. Charlotte had, every morning, a private meeting with Lady Charlotte and with Madame Beckerdorf in her dressing room, in which the intelligence of the household was reviewed and the day's management decisions were taken. If Amelia had received a letter that the Queen wanted to see, the letter would, by some intervention, find its way onto the Queen's desk before reaching Amelia. If Amelia had been in conversation with Fitzroy at some family event the previous evening, the Queen would know by 10 in the morning exactly how long the conversation had lasted, and what, as far as it could be overheard, had been discussed. Amelia knew about this surveillance. She could not have failed to know. Everyone in the household knew. The watchfulness of the Queen's ladies was one of the central facts of life in the Queen's house and at Windsor, and the princesses who had grown up in it had learned to navigate it with the skills of people who have been watched all their lives. Amelia's strategies of evasion were the strategies of a clever young woman who understood her surveillance state. She kept her real letters in private boxes that the Queen's ladies could not access. She wrote her real correspondence in moments when she could not be observed. She used intermediaries who were not part of the Queen's network. She built up, around her secret life with Fitzroy, an underground that operated below the level of the Queen's daily intelligence. The underground was, for the years of the relationship, mostly successful. The Queen knew that there was an attachment. The Queen could not entirely document its details. The letters that the Queen did manage to read or to hear about were the surface ripples of a much larger relationship that Amelia had successfully kept hidden. The Queen, in her morning conferences with her ladies, reviewed the surface evidence and made her reproachful interventions. The deeper relationship continued in the underground undisturbed. Amelia hated her mother for this. The hatred was not the absolute hatred of a young woman in her early 20s for a parent who has crossed her. It was the slower, more corrosive resentment of a daughter who has watched over years the determined frustration of the one part of her life that mattered to her. In her letters to her brothers, to George the Prince of Wales, and to Frederick the Duke of York, Amelia writes about her mother in tones that range from frustration to genuine bitterness. She complains of her mother's lack of affection for her. She is in these letters a young woman in love who is being prevented from acting on the love by the person closest to her, and the resentment is in its way exactly what we would expect. The letters home from Amelia to her brothers, to George, whom she addressed in extravagant terms as "my dear angelic brother," or "my beloved eau de miel." Her honey water, her sweetness, are in their way the central body of personal writing she left behind. George loved her. He had been throughout her childhood a distant but affectionate older brother. He was, by the early 1800s, the most senior figure in the family who could be relied on to be sympathetic to her plight, and she wrote to him with the open frankness of a sister who knew that he was not going to betray her. George's role in the Fitzroy affair was, by every account, supportive. He did not, when he learned of the relationship, condemn it. He understood, with the long experience of his own complicated romantic life, exactly what kind of position his sister was in. He could not, of course, change the legal facts. He could not get the king to approve the marriage. He could not override the Royal Marriages Act. But he could, and did, listen to her. He visited her when he could. He read her letters with attention. He gave her, in the sympathetic way that a sympathetic older brother gives, the comfort of being heard. Amelia, in her letters, describes George's visits in the warmest possible terms. She calls them really and truly a cordial being, in the period, both a strong restorative drink and by extension anything that revived the spirit. George, when he came, revived her. The hours she spent with him in her sitting room, when he came down to Windsor or to wherever she happened to be, were by her own report some of the happiest hours of her late 20s. I want to spend a moment on what the relationship with Fitzroy meant in Amelia's daily life, because I think the texture of it is part of what made it bearable for her over a decade of impossibility. It was, first of all, secret. The secrecy itself was both a difficulty and, in a way, a protection. The secrecy meant that the relationship existed in a private space that the Queen could not entirely reach. The Queen knew about it. The Queen disapproved. But the Queen could not, day to day, prevent the private continuity of feeling that ran between Amelia and Fitzroy. The letters were written in private. The miniature portrait was kept in private. The initials AFR were used in private. The relationship was built up day by day in a private register that ran underneath the public surface of Amelia's life, and that gave her, more than any other element of her daily experience, the sense of being fully alive. It was, second, sustaining. Amelia was, by her early 20s, a woman in declining physical health, in a household that gave her very little personal scope, with no prospect of marriage or independent life, with a father drifting into recurring episodes of illness, and a mother whose anxiety filled every room. The relationship with Fitzroy was, in this context, the private thing that kept her from despair. She had, in her own private reckoning, a person to whom she was committed, a person who was committed to her, and a future, even if only an imagined and impossible future, in which the two of them might at last be openly together. She knew it was a fiction, but the fiction was the structural support that her real present required. It was, third, mutual. Fitzroy, by every account that survives, returned the affection. He kept her letters. He wrote her letters in return. He understood the impossibility of the situation, and he did not, in the long course of the relationship, ever attempt to push for a public resolution that would have endangered her further. He was, because the situation required, patient. He was discreet. He was, throughout the years, exactly the shape of man that the impossible position needed him to be. After Amelia's death, he would continue to live in England for several more years before eventually, in 1816, marrying a widow named Eliza Savage. The marriage to Mrs. Savage produced no children. He died many years later, in his 80s, having outlived Amelia by more than 4 decades. He never, by any account that survives, spoke publicly about the relationship. There is an additional twist in the story that I want to mention briefly, because it sets up some of the bitterness of the late stages. The Queen, by 1810, the year of Amelia's death, had begun to consider the possibility of arranging a marriage for one of her younger daughters to a German prince, specifically to a son of one of the smaller German ducal houses. The plan was not advanced. It was a private intention rather than a formal proposal, but the timing of it, in retrospect, is striking. The Queen was beginning to think, after years of refusing to consider any marriage for any of her daughters, that perhaps a marriage might be arranged. The likely candidate, given the practicalities, was either Mary or Amelia. Amelia by this point was 26 years old. She was in serious decline from the illness that would kill her. She was deeply attached, in the long secret way we have been describing, to Charles Fitzroy. The Queen's plan, if it had been pursued, would have meant pulling Amelia away from the relationship she considered her marriage and pushing her into a formal dynastic arrangement with a man she did not know. The plan, by every reading of the Queen's intentions, was specifically intended to break the Fitzroy attachment. The Queen, when she sounded out possibilities, found that the available German prince was not interested in either of the older princesses, and the King, when the matter was raised with him, took it badly enough that the Queen retreated immediately. The Queen's surviving anxiety about the King's mental health continued to override every other consideration. The plan was dropped, but the fact that the Queen had been considering it, that, after years of preventing any of the daughters from marrying anyone, she was now willing to push for the marriage of Amelia, specifically because it would break the Fitzroy attachment, landed badly with Amelia when she heard about it. It confirmed, in her mind, the worst readings of her mother's character. It was, in her view, not concern for her welfare that motivated the Queen, but concern for the household's image. The relationship between Amelia and the Queen, which had been deteriorating for years, reached its lowest point in this period. By the autumn of 1810, the two women were, in any meaningful sense, estranged. They lived in the same household. They saw each other daily at family events, but the warmth between them, which had perhaps existed in form in Amelia's childhood, was entirely gone. This was the situation then, in the autumn of 1810, a young woman of 26 in serious physical decline. A long secret love affair, sustained by letters with a man 21 years her senior, whom she could not openly marry. A father in fragile health, increasingly preoccupied with his own difficulties. A mother she had come to deeply resent. Two close older sisters, Mary and Sophia, who continued to provide the companionship she had relied on since childhood. A devoted older brother, the Prince of Wales, who visited when he could, but was by the realities of his own life often not present. It was by every measure that survives a difficult life. It was about to become considerably more difficult. In the late summer of 1810, Amelia's health, which had been bad for years, took a sharp turn for the worse, and the long final stretch of her short life, the stretch that would end her own story, and in the process trigger the constitutional crisis that produced the formal regency, began. The final stretch of Amelia's life began by the fact that many serious illnesses begin with a setback that initially looked routine. In 1808, when she was 25, she fell ill with what the household physicians described as a severe attack of measles. Measles in the early 19th century was a serious illness in adults whose constitutions were already compromised. Amelia's constitution had been compromised for years. The measles, when it came, hit her hard. She was confined to her bed for weeks. She ran a high fever. The household physicians applied the period's standard treatments, which involved bleeding, blistering, and various tonic preparations of limited effectiveness. She survived the acute phase of the illness, but she did not, through how healthier patients did, return to her former self afterward. The measles had broken something. The pre-existing tubercular infection in her lungs, which had been smouldering for years at a low level, was now markedly worse. She coughed continuously. She was perpetually tired. She had episodes of breathlessness that prevented her from walking more than a short distance. The cheerful, adaptable young woman of her late teens, who had taken the cold sea bathing every summer morning at Weymouth, and who had walked the long gravel paths at Windsor with her sisters, was, by the end of 1808, essentially gone. In her place was a thin invalid who spent most of her days on a chaise longue in her sitting room, with her sisters Mary and Sophia in attendance, and who could not, even on her better days, manage any of the physical activities of her former life. I want you to sit for a moment with the weight of what was happening to her. She was 25 years old. She had, in some part of her own thinking, expected to recover. The illness of 1798, when she was 14, had passed. The various smaller episodes of her late teens and early 20s had passed. The body of a young woman, in her own working assumption, was a body that recovered from things. But this illness, the measles of 1808, was not passing. The cough was not clearing. The fatigue was not lifting. She watched, in the clear way that intelligent people watch their own bodies, the fact of her own decline. She wrote to her brother Frederick, in the late autumn of 1808, that she was beginning to feel an old woman before my time. The admission, in a letter to a sympathetic older brother, that she understood what was happening to her and was doing the work of accepting it. She wrote to Fitzroy more often. The letters from this period are the longest and most detailed of the correspondence. She told him about her physical state, the cough, the fatigue, the daily measurements of how far she had been able to walk and how much to eat. She told him about her emotional state, the boredom of long invalid days, the flashes of impatience with her sisters and her attendants, the deeper underlying sense of a life closing down before it had really opened. She told him about her hopes, her persistent hope, which she could not quite let go of, that the situation might somehow be resolved, that the Royal Marriages Act might somehow be circumvented, that the years of impossible separation might end in some unexpected way. She knew the hopes were not realistic. She wrote them down anyway. The act of writing them, with the person who had received them on the other end, was part of how she kept her own life from becoming entirely unbearable. The depressing atmosphere at Windsor, with the Queen in her own state of continuous anxiety about the King's increasingly fragile health, and with the household routines pressed flat by the long shadow of repeated illness, made Amelia's condition worse. The King, observing his daughter's decline with mounting distress, decided that she needed to be sent to Weymouth, the seaside town where the family had spent so many summers, in the hope that the sea air and the change of scene might restore something. Her sister Mary, who by 1808 was 32 years old and unmarried, and who had become, through long practice, the sister most able to manage extended periods of nursing, would accompany her. The journey to Weymouth was made in the late summer of 1808. Amelia, weak from the illness, travelled in a carriage that had been specially fitted for her comfort, with cushions, a folding rest for her feet, and a portable medicine chest that the household physicians had prepared. The carriage stopped at intervals along the road from London to allow her to rest. The journey, which a healthy traveller would have managed in 2 days, took 4 for Amelia. She arrived at Augusta Lodge, the family residence on the Weymouth seafront. The lodge was the house that the family had used for nearly 20 years, and Amelia knew it well. Her own room on the upper floor had been prepared for her by the household staff. She was put to bed. The seaside doctor, a local practitioner named Dr. Beaver, who had attended the family for years, came in to examine her. The improvement at Weymouth was by every account slight. Amelia was a little stronger by the autumn. She could, on her better days, sit up in a chair by the window of her room and look out over the bay, where the fishing boats came and went, and the gulls called, and the long sweep of pale sand reached out below her toward the south. She could, Occasionally, take short walks on the esplanade, with Mary on one arm and a footman on the other, going perhaps 100 yards before she needed to sit on one of the benches and rest. She could not, by her physical condition, take the sea bathing that had been the great morning ritual of her earlier visits. She could only, in the reduced register that the illness had imposed, look at the sea from a window and remember what it had been like to bathe in it. Mary was constantly with her. The two sisters in the upstairs sitting room of Gloucester Lodge through the autumn of 1808 and the winter of 1809 established a daily routine that would, with variations, continue until Amelia's death 2 years later. Mary read aloud to her. Mary wrote her letters for her on the days when Amelia was too weak to hold a pen. Mary brushed her hair, helped her dress, sat with her through the long evenings when the wind off the sea rattled the windows of the lodge, and the fire in the grate was the only point in the room. The bond between the two sisters, which had been formed in the nursery 30 years earlier, was now the central fact of both their lives. Mary, in her early 30s, had effectively become Amelia's nurse and companion, and would remain so until the end. There was a temporary improvement in 1809. In the spring of 1809, when Amelia was 26, she was strong enough to take a few short walks each day in the garden of Gloucester Lodge. She corresponded again, in her own hand, with Fitzroy, with George the Prince of Wales, with her younger niece Charlotte, who was now 13, and beginning to take a serious interest in her dying aunt. She played, very occasionally and very briefly, on the harp that had been brought down from London for her. She wrote to her brother Frederick, the Duke of York, that she felt for the first time in over a year that she might possibly recover. She did not recover. The improvement was the temporary improvement that tubercular patients often experience when the body's resources gather for a period before the next decline. By the late summer of 1809 she was again worse. By the autumn she could not walk in the garden any more. By the winter of 1809 to 1810 she was confined again to her room. The decision was made, in the spring of 1810, to bring her back to Windsor. The seaside experiment had failed. There was no further benefit to be had at Weymouth. She would return to the family estate, where the household physicians could attend her more closely, and where the family could be near her. The journey back was harder than the journey out had been. She was carried on and off the carriage by footmen at each stop. She arrived at Windsor in May 1810, exhausted, frail, and visibly closer to the end than she had been when she left for Weymouth 2 years earlier. She was settled at Augusta Lodge, a residence within the Windsor Great Park, near the Royal Lodge where she had been born 26 years and 10 months earlier. Augusta Lodge was a comfortable building. It had been chosen for her because it was quiet, because it was set away from the main bustle of the castle and the larger lodges, and because it was enough to be run efficiently by a reduced household. Her sister Mary moved into the lodge with her. Her brother George, the Prince of Wales, took to riding down from London once or twice a week to visit her. Her father, the King, was in residence at the castle and came to see her every day that her condition permitted. I want you to picture Augusta Lodge in the late summer of 1810. It is a 2-story building of pinkish brick, set in a clearing in a wooded section of the great park, perhaps a mile south of the main castle. There is a lawn at the front, with a gravel sweep where the carriages can draw up. There is a kitchen garden at the back, walled in old red brick. There are mature trees on 3 sides, oaks and chestnuts, and a few sycamores planted in the early 18th century, now grown large and casting deep shadows through the lawn in the long evenings of late summer. Amelia's room is on the upper floor, on the south side of the building, with a single tall window looking out over the lawn and the trees beyond. The room has been arranged for her comfort. The bed has been brought close to the window so that she can see the trees from where she lies. There is a table beside the bed with her medicines, a glass of water, a bell that she can ring if she needs anything in the night. There is a writing desk at the foot of the bed, where Mary sits to write the letters that Amelia dictates on the days she has the energy to speak. There is a chaise longue on the opposite wall, where Amelia sometimes lies in the afternoons when she is well enough to leave the bed for a few hours. There is a fireplace, with a fire kept burning steadily through the cooler weather. There is a chair by the bed where Mary sits, and another chair by the window where the visiting physicians sit when they come for their twice-daily examinations. The smell of the room through these months is the smell of a long sick room in a country house. There is the smell of the wood fire. There is the medicinal smell of the apothecary's preparations on the bedside table. There is the floral smell of the flowers that Mary cuts each morning from the flower garden at the back of the lodge, sweet peas through July, roses through August, late dahlias and Michaelmas daisies through September and October, and arranges in a porcelain vase on the writing desk. There is the clean smell of fresh linen, which the household changes daily on Amelia's bed. The sound of the room is mostly the sounds of a country house in summer, the wind in the trees outside the window, the wood pigeons calling in the canopy above the lodge, the distant sounds of the household at work, the cook in the kitchen below, the maids on the stairs, the gardener with his wheelbarrow on the gravel path at the side of the building, the scratch of Mary's pen on paper when she writes Amelia's letters, breathing of Amelia herself when she sleeps, the occasional comment when Amelia is awake enough to talk between the two sisters. This was the room that Amelia spent her last 6 months in. This was the room from which she ordered the mourning ring for her father, dictated her will, wrote her last letters to Fitzroy, said her last goodbyes to her brothers when they came to visit. This was the room she died in on the 2nd of November 1810 at 12 o'clock noon. The King's visits in the spring and summer of 1810 are some of the most quietly affecting scenes in the long story of his relationship with her. He was, by this point, 71 years old, and showing the early signs of the final episode of his illness that would, by November, have him fully removed from his constitutional functions. He was already not himself in many of the daily registers of his life, but he was, when he came to Augusta Lodge to see Amelia, more himself than he was anywhere else. He sat by her bed. He held her hand. He talked to her about things: the gardens, a tree he had seen on his ride, a piece of music he had heard played at the castle, the daily news of the household. She, in her weakness, could rarely manage extended conversation, but she could lie quietly and listen and watch him, and the comfort of his presence was, by every account that survives, the deepest comfort she had in this period. He could not stay long. The visits were measured on his side by the household physician's assessments of how much he could safely engage with her without risking his own emotional balance. They were measured on her side by her own diminishing physical capacity. Half an hour was by the late summer the most she could manage. The King would come in. He would sit. He would speak. She would respond as she could. He would kiss her forehead. He would leave. The whole visit, by August 1810, took perhaps 35 minutes from the moment he arrived at the door of the lodge to the moment his carriage rolled back out toward the castle, but he came every day. In October 1810, when she was 27, the final illness arrived. Until then, the underlying disease had been the consuming progression of pulmonary tuberculosis. In October, she developed, on top of the tuberculosis, an acute bacterial skin infection called erysipelas. erysipelas, known in the period also as St. Anthony's fire, for the way the rash inflamed the skin into raised red wheals, was an extremely dangerous infection in the era before antibiotics. In a healthy patient, it could be survived. In a patient already weakened by tuberculosis, it was generally fatal. Amelia's case was severe. The rash spread by every contemporary medical record, from her head down over the whole of her body. The visible outward inflammation was matched by an internal fever that she could not break. She was confined to her bed from the 25th of October. The household physicians, assembled in continuous consultation at Augusta Lodge, gave her, by the end of October, no further hope of recovery. The king at the castle was told of the change in his daughter's condition. He responded in a way that the household physicians found alarming. He summoned the doctors to him at 7 o'clock every morning, and 3 or 4 other times during each day, questioning them minutely about her condition. He could not be persuaded to limit the inquiries. He could not be calmed by reassurance. The obsessive attention he was now giving to Amelia's condition was, the physicians recognized, a sign that his own underlying illness was beginning to surface. The strain of watching his daughter die was, as the Queen had feared for years, pushing him toward the edge of another episode. But Amelia was the king's child, and the king was the king. The physicians could not refuse to attend on him. They came at 7 each morning, they came again at noon, they came again in the late afternoon, they came again before he went to bed. They reported, in the measured language they used for him, on her condition. They watched, with the eyes of long practice, the worsening signs in his own state, as the daughter's condition deteriorated. In the last week of October, while she lay at Augusta Lodge in the final stage of her illness, Amelia did one last thing for her father. She arranged, through her sister Mary, with the court jewellers Rundell, Bridge and Co., for the manufacture of a mourning ring. The mourning ring was a piece of jewellery in the period style, a gold band with a setting of diamonds around a central crystal panel, under which was placed a lock of her own hair. Mourning rings were, by the conventions belonging to that world, the private memorials that the wealthy commissioned for the survivors of a death, designed to be worn by a close relative as a continuous physical reminder of the person who had died. They were ordered conventionally by the surviving relative after the death as a private commemoration. Amelia, knowing she was dying, ordered the ring herself in advance and arranged for it to be presented to her father. The ring was finished while she was still alive. It was brought to Augusta Lodge, packaged in a leather case. From there it was carried, by one of the household attendants, up to the castle, where it was presented to the king with a note from Amelia explaining what it was. The king opened the case. He looked at the ring with the lock of his daughter's hair under the crystal. He understood immediately what it was, that his daughter, knowing she was dying, had arranged to give him her hair to remember her by. He burst into tears. The story, when it became known in the household over the following days, was the detail that came to stand for the whole of the long tragedy of Amelia's final illness. The dying daughter, ordering the mourning ring for the father who could not bear to lose her. The father, opening the case in his own private apartments at the castle, and weeping over the lock of hair. The whole texture of their love for each other, compressed into that single object passed between 2 rooms. The ring survives. It is, in the long preservation of the royal collection, still in existence. It is one of the physical objects, now over 200 years old, that retains a direct material connection to the moment we are walking through tonight. I want to pause for a moment before we come to the death itself, and tell you about one more thing she did in those final days. Amelia, who knew she was dying, made a will. The will was simple. She left all of her clothing to her personal maid, in recognition of the maid's long service to her. She left everything else, her jewellery, her books, her papers, her accumulated possessions of 27 years, to Charles Fitzroy. The will was the last public-facing act of the long secret marriage. It was in its way the closest she could come to a formal acknowledgement of the relationship. By leaving everything to Fitzroy, she was saying, in the permanent record of a will, that he was her husband in the only sense that mattered to her. The legal will would be executed after her death. Fitzroy would receive the inheritance. The household, the family, the wider public, anyone who paid attention would know that the youngest daughter of the king had, in her final disposition, named a senior army equerry as her heir. The will was also an act of resistance. The Queen could not undo it. The whole long surveillance of the household, which had successfully prevented Amelia from openly marrying Fitzroy in life, could not prevent her from openly leaving him everything in death. She had found, in the last weeks of her short life, the legal mechanism that finally permitted her to make the relationship visible. She also made one last attempt, through her physician, to ask whether the king might be approached about the possibility of giving belated consent to the marriage. The physician, with the judgment of a man who knew the king's current state, declined to convey the request. The king was, by late October, on the edge of his own illness. To ask him about the marriage would have been to push him over. The marriage, even at the end, was not permitted. In the last few days, as the erysipelas advanced and the underlying tuberculosis exhausted what was left of her strength, Amelia made her goodbyes. She spoke to her sister Mary at length, in the long hours when the household had retreated and the two of them were alone in the upstairs room. She thanked Mary for the years of nursing, for the time at Weymouth in 1808 and 1809, for the long months at Augusta Lodge, for the presence that had made the long illness bearable. Mary, who had not been thanked in any formal way for any of it, wept. The two sisters held each other's hands, in the way of two women who had been together since the older one was 12 and the younger was 4, and who were now, in the final weeks of the younger one's life, doing the work of preparing to let go. Sophia visited. So did several of the brothers. Frederick, William, Edward, Augustus, Adolphus all came down to Windsor in the last week. They sat with her, in turn, in the upstairs room. They spoke briefly. They said the last things that brothers say to dying sisters. They left, by every account, in tears. The Prince of Wales rode down from London on the 31st of October, sat with her for an hour, kissed her forehead, promised with the warmth that George had always shown her that he would look after her affairs after her death, that Fitzroy would receive everything as she had directed, that he would hold her memory carefully for the rest of his own life. She smiled at him in the weak way she could still smile, and he left the room with his eyes full and walked down the stairs of the lodge holding the banister for support. The Queen did not visit. The breach between mother and daughter by this stage had become too deep to bridge. The Queen stayed at the castle, where she could be informed of Amelia's condition without having to be in the room with her. Whether this was Amelia's choice, the Queen's choice, or some mutual avoidance that neither of them quite owned, is not entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that the last visit between mother and daughter had taken place weeks earlier, and that neither of them attempted to arrange another. The Queen, when the death came, would learn of it from the household physicians at the castle. She would receive the news with the composed grief that her position required of her, but she would not, by every account, weep. The complicated feelings between her and her youngest daughter, Whatever they had been around the long, difficult years of the Fitzroy affair did not resolve themselves at the deathbed. They simply, in the permanent way that some unresolved family difficulties simply remain, ended. The king, of course, was in the different category that we have been describing. He came to Augusta Lodge as often as the household physicians would allow him in the last weeks. The visits were brief. He sat by her bed. He held her hand. He said very little. By the late stages, both because he was beginning to lose his words in the early stretches of his own illness, and because there was in the way of these things very little left to say. The last visit, by the records of the household, took place perhaps 3 or 4 days before the death. He sat with her for 15 minutes. He kissed her forehead. He left. He never saw her again alive. The death came on the morning of the 2nd of November, 1810. It was a Friday. The day was overcast with a grey rain falling intermittently on the trees of the great park outside the windows of Augusta Lodge. Amelia had been in decline for several days. She was, by the morning of the 2nd, no longer fully conscious. Her sister Mary was at her bedside, where she had been for most of the previous week. 2 of the household physicians were in the room, in the attendance that the period required at a deathbed. A fire was burning in the grate. The window was open, on the doctor's instructions, to allow some fresh air into the room. The room itself was and quiet. The walls were papered in a pale pattern of flowers on a cream ground. The curtains at the window were of green silk, drawn back to let in what little daylight the overcast morning provided. The bed was a 4-poster of pale wood, with white linen hangings drawn back at the head and foot. The bed linen was clean fresh sheets had been put on that morning, in the daily routine that the household maintained even at this stage. There was a bedside table with a glass of water, a bowl with a damp cloth for cooling Amelia's forehead, a brown medicine bottle with a label written in the apothecary's hand, and a single porcelain candlestick with an unlit candle in it. Mary's chair was drawn up close to the bed on the right side, where her sister could most easily see her if she opened her eyes. The 2 physicians stood at a respectful distance, one near the window, one near the foot of the bed, speaking very quietly to each other in the murmurs that long medical practice produces in such rooms. The smell of the room was the composite smell of a long sick room in late autumn. The wood of the fire-apple wood, in the household's preferred fuel for the smaller fireplaces, had a sweet note that mixed with the lavender water that Mary had been using to dab at Amelia's temples. There was the faint medicinal smell of the apothecary's preparations on the bedside table. There was the cold mineral smell of the rain coming in through the open window. There was very faintly the smell that human beings produce in any sustained close space. The sound of the room was in the way of any deathbed, mostly silence, the crackle of the apple wood fire, the faint patter of the rain on the leaves of the oak tree outside the window, the breathing of Amelia herself, the breaths now noticeably slower than they had been the previous day, with longer gaps between them, the rustle of Mary's silk dress when she shifted in her chair, the very occasional whispered comment between the 2 physicians. From outside the lodge, very distantly, the sound of a single carriage passing on the main drive of the park, perhaps half a mile away. Mary watched her sister's face. The face, in the pale grey light of the overcast morning, was thinner than it had been a month ago, with the waxy quality that the dying acquire in their last hours. The eyes were closed, the lips were parted. The dark hair, which Mary had brushed gently the previous evening, lay quietly against the white linen pillow. Mary held her sister's hand, which was thin and cool and light in her own. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the long vigil of the previous 2 weeks had not already covered. She simply sat and watched. and waited. The king, at the castle, had been informed that the end was near. He could not be brought to Augusta Lodge by the household physician's judgment. His own emotional state was now too fragile for him to manage a final scene at his daughter's bedside. He sat in his own apartments at the castle, with the Queen and several of his other children gathered around him, waiting for word. Amelia's breathing slowed through the morning. By 11 o'clock, the long pauses between breaths had begun. The senior physician, watching the second hand of his pocket watch, noted that the gaps were now lengthening, 15 seconds between breaths, then 20, then 30. The body was, in its way, beginning the final work of letting go. By 12 o'clock noon, the breathing had stopped entirely. There was a final exhalation. There was no further intake. Mary, holding the hand, felt the final relaxation of her sister's fingers in her own. She did not regain consciousness. She did not, by the report of her sister Mary and the attending physicians, suffer at the very end. The death itself was peaceful, where some deaths are peaceful. The clock on the chimney piece of the room, which one of the physicians finally crossed to and observed, read 12 precisely. The 2nd of November 1810. 12 o'clock noon. By accident of the calendar, the day of her death was also the 43rd birthday of her brother Edward, the Duke of Kent. Edward, in due course, would be the father of the future Queen Victoria. On this day, in 1810, he was simply one of Amelia's older brothers, marking his birthday in a household that had just lost its youngest member. The coincidence? Edward's birthday and Amelia's death falling on the same date would haunt him quietly for the rest of his life. He never, by any account that survives, celebrated his birthday afterward without first observing the anniversary of Amelia's death. The news was sent to the castle. The king received it. The king, in the account that survives from the household physicians, did not at first react. He sat very still. He did not weep. He did not speak. He sat for a long time in his chair in his apartments, with the Queen beside him, and the room held its breath. After a long time, perhaps half an hour, he stood up, walked into his bedroom, and closed the door. He was, by that moment, no longer the king his household had known. The mind that had held together, through 8 episodes of illness over 22 years, finally broke. The breakdown that began in the late afternoon of the 2nd of November, 1810, would not lift. The king would never again return to the self he had been. The Regency Act of 1811, which would be passed by Parliament 3 months later, formalised the transfer of his constitutional functions to his eldest son. The Prince of Wales, who had been waiting for power for 48 years, was now Prince Regent. The era we now call the Regency had begun. It had begun, although no one would have framed it this way at the time, on the day Princess Amelia died. The aftermath of Amelia's death played out, in the days and weeks and years that followed, on several different scales at once. The most immediate scale was the family. Mary, the sister who had nursed her through the last 2 years, sat with the body for several hours after the death, as the period considered appropriate. She arranged the final preparations, the closing of the eyes, the smoothing of the hair, the laying out of the body in the white burial gown that had been prepared. She remained in the room until the household undertakers arrived in the late afternoon, at which point she went exhausted into the next room and slept for the first sustained hours she had managed in over a week. She would, in the years that followed, write 1,000 letters to her brother George, the Prince of Wales, describing the king's condition during his final illness, and the letters would be the central archival source for understanding the king's last decade. But on the afternoon of the 2nd of November 1810, she simply slept. George, the Prince of Wales, when he received the news at his apartments at Carlton House in London, was, by every account that survives, devastated. He had loved Amelia as a sister, in the distant, affectionate way that older brothers can love much younger sisters, and her death broke something in him that did not entirely heal. He travelled down to Windsor that evening. He sat with Mary, with Sophia, with the few other family members assembled at the castle. He visited his father, who could not, in his current state, fully process the visit. He did what could be done. After her funeral, George developed a permanent psychological response to his sister's death. From November 1810 onward, until his own death in 1830, he could not sleep in a room that was not lit by several wax candles. Whether the candles were a guard against the darkness in which his sister had died, or against some dread that Amelia's death had crystallized in him, or against some other private association, the household never entirely understood. What was clear was that the candles were, from this point forward, a fixed requirement of his bedchamber. The household knew. The personal attendants knew. Wherever the Prince Regent slept, there were candles burning. He could mention his sister, in the months and years that followed, only with the immediate response of bursting into tears. 3 years after her death, in 1813, he was still unable to hear her name spoken without weeping. The king, meanwhile, had collapsed entirely. His final illness, which began in the afternoon of Amelia's death, was different in quality from the earlier episodes. The earlier episodes had been acute. They had had clear beginnings and, eventually, clear ends. The king had, in 1789 and in 1801 and in 1804, recovered. The illness that began in November of 1810 did not recover. It deepened steadily over the following months. By February of 1811, when Parliament passed the Regency Act, the king was clearly beyond any near-term recovery. By the summer, he was being kept in a set of permanent rooms at Windsor, attended by a rotating staff of physicians and personal attendants, with very limited contact with the outside world. He would live on in this state, isolated and confused, for 9 more years before his own death in January 1820. What happened to the king during those 9 years is one of the most quietly painful records in British royal history. The medical papers from the period, which survive in the royal archives, document the disappearance of his earlier self. He held imaginary conversations with people who were not in the room. He did not always recognize his attendants. He could be calm for stretches and severely agitated for other stretches. The Queen, whose anxiety about his condition had shaped the family's life for over 2 decades, visited him at first, but the visits became more difficult. By 1813, the king was, on his bad days, openly fearful of the Queen. She gradually stopped coming. By the last years of his life, the Queen had effectively withdrawn from the daily care of her husband, leaving the work to the attendants and the physicians. The most affecting feature of the king's last years, however, was the imaginary conversation he held repeatedly over many months with his dead daughter. The king believed, in his confusion, that Amelia was alive. He believed that she was in Hanover, the German territory of the British royal family, on the continent, with a large family of her own. He believed that she was healthy, married, content. He believed, in one persistent variation of the delusion, that she would never grow older and would always be well. He spoke to her in imaginary conversation many times. The household physicians recorded the conversations in their daily reports. In one report written in November 1811, exactly a year after her death, Dr. Matthew Bailey, one of the king's attending physicians, wrote to the Prince Regent that the king had a long conversation with Princess Amelia as if she was in the room with him, and gave her a minute account of all the particulars of her funeral. The detail is one of those clinical observations that opens like a door onto the deeper architecture of the king's grief. He could not accept that she was dead. He had constructed, in the protective workings of his damaged mind, a parallel reality in which she was alive in Germany, but he also, simultaneously, knew that she was dead, knew it in and terrible detail of having lived through her funeral, and his imaginary conversation with her involved telling her, in detail, about her own funeral. The two contradictory understandings that she was alive, that she was dead, coexisted in his mind without resolving. He talked to her about her funeral. He believed she was alive to be talked to. He believed she was dead enough to have been buried. The conversations went on. The room in which the king held these conversations by the late stages of his confinement was a set of apartments in the north wing of Windsor Castle, looking out over the upper ward toward the round tower. The rooms had been adapted for his confinement, the sharp objects removed, the windows fitted with secure catches, the doors arranged to allow his attendants to enter quietly without alarming him. He spent most of his hours in a drawing room with a view of the upper ward. He read very little. His eyesight, by this period, had failed almost entirely, and he had become essentially blind in his last years. He played the harpsichord occasionally by ear, the old simple pieces he had learned in childhood. He talked to his attendants when he was lucid enough to recognize them. He talked more often to people who were not there. Amelia was the figure he talked to most often. The other dead children, Octavius, who had died in 1783, Alfred, 1782, Amelia, 1810, all populated his imaginary household, but Amelia was the one to whom he addressed most of his conversation. He spoke to her about the gardens. He spoke to her about her sisters. He spoke on the bad days in confused fragments that the attendants could barely follow. He spoke on the better days with something close to the affectionate parental voice he had used for her when she was alive. Another of his persistent delusions was even more piercing. According to Dr. Willis, one of his other physicians, the king would sometimes cry out, in a wild, monotonous, delirious way, "Oh, Emily, why won't you save your father? I hate all the physicians." Emily, the private name he had used for her since her birth on the 7th of August 1783. Emily, save your father. The cry of a man who, in his own breaking mind, understood that the daughter he had loved most was the only person who could have anchored him, and who was no longer there. He never recovered. He died on the 29th of January, 1820, at Windsor, at the age of 81, after 9 years of confinement and isolation. The Queen had predeceased him by 14 months, dying at Kew in November 1818 at the age of 74. The Prince Regent, who had become regent in February 1811 in the months after Amelia's death, succeeded his father as King George IV on the 29th of January 1820, the day his father died. He would reign for 10 years before his own death in 1830. His daughter, Princess Charlotte, who had been Amelia's young niece, died in childbirth in 1817, depriving the country of the heir who had been expected to follow her father. The succession passed eventually, through a complicated set of family arrangements, to George III's son Edward, the Duke of Kent, the brother whose 43rd birthday had fallen on the day of Amelia's death, and from Edward to his daughter Victoria, who would come to the throne in 1837. The whole arc of the British royal family for the next several decades, the regency, the reign of George IV, the brief reign of William IV, the long reign of Victoria, was shaped by the events of those few years around Amelia's death. The political rearrangements followed from the king's collapse. The death itself was the personal tragedy at the centre of a much larger constitutional and cultural transformation. Amelia's funeral was held on the 13th of November, 11 days after her death, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The funeral followed the conventions from that era for royal female funerals. Her sisters and her mother were not present at the funeral itself. The period considered the formal funeral service to be too distressing for the close female relatives, who were expected to mourn privately rather than publicly. The mourners at the chapel were her brothers, and a selection of senior household officials and her ladies-in-waiting. Several of her brothers, by the contemporary accounts, were in floods of tears through the service. The Prince of Wales was affected. The whole atmosphere of the chapel, on the cold autumn afternoon of the 13th of November, was one of unusually deep family grief. I want you to picture the cortege that brought her body the short distance from Augusta Lodge to St. George's Chapel that afternoon. The procession formed at Augusta Lodge in the early afternoon. The coffin, a dark coffin of polished oak with brass fittings, draped in a black velvet pall, was carried out by 6 of the senior household attendants and placed in the funeral carriage that was waiting on the gravel sweep. The carriage, drawn by 6 black horses with black plumes on their bridles, moved slowly out of the lodge and onto the main drive of the great park. Behind it, in a long line, came the mourning carriages, the carriages of the brothers, senior household officials, ladies-in-waiting, and the chief attendants. The whole procession, perhaps 20 carriages in total, moved at a walking pace along the gravel drive of the park toward the castle. The afternoon was cold and grey. A thin, damp mist hung over the trees of the park. The fallen leaves of the late autumn, the deep golds and coppers of the chestnuts, the rusty browns of the oaks, lay thick on the gravel drive and on the lawns of the park. Groups of estate workers and local people stood at the edges of the drive with their hats removed, watching the procession pass. There was no sound in the cold afternoon except the clop of the horses' hooves on the gravel and the creak of the carriage wheels, and in the distance the tolling of the bell of St. George's Chapel as the procession approached. The procession entered the lower ward of Windsor Castle through the great gateway. It moved past the houses of the canons of the chapel. It came to a halt at the west door of St. George's Chapel. The coffin was lifted from the carriage by the senior attendants. It was carried slowly and carefully through the great west door and up the long aisle of the chapel toward the choir, where the funeral service would be held. The chapel itself, on the afternoon of the 13th of November, was lit only by candles. The grey afternoon light through the great west window was supplemented by perhaps 200 candles set in stands along the walls of the nave and in the great candelabra above the choir. The light was and against the cold dark stone of the medieval interior. The fan vaulting of the roof, the most beautiful late medieval vaulting in England, completed in the early 16th century, disappeared into the high shadows above the candles. The stalls of the choir, where the Knights of the Garter had their carved seats with the painted plates of their arms, were filled with the dark figures of the brothers and the senior mourners. The whole space, in the illumination of the candles, had the quality that great churches acquire on the afternoons of important funerals, the weight of accumulated centuries of similar services, the ceremonial gravity of a place that had received many generations of royal dead. The service was conducted by the Dean of Windsor. The music was provided by the chapel choir, with the organ accompanying. The anthems sung were the customary anthems for royal funeral settings by Purcell and Handel that had been used for previous family deaths and that were, in the continuity of the chapel's musical tradition, almost a family inheritance. The brothers wept openly through the service. The Prince of Wales, who had ridden down from London the previous day, sat in the front row of the choir with his face in his hands. The body was placed in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, where it remains. The vault is the burial place of most of the late Hanoverian and Saxe-Coburg royals, including, eventually, Amelia's parents George III and Queen Charlotte, and most of her siblings. She lies among them now, in the long arrangement of the royal vault, with the marker that records her dates: born 1783, died 1810, 27 years. The will was executed in due course. Charles Fitzroy received Amelia's possessions as she had directed. The papers were delivered, the jewellery was delivered, the books, the accumulated objects of a princess's life, all came to him. He kept them for the rest of his own life, which extended for many decades after Amelia's death. He never spoke publicly about her. He continued in his role as a senior army officer through the long final stages of the Napoleonic Wars and through the early Victorian period. He married eventually, in 1816, 6 years after Amelia's death, to a widow named Eliza Savage. The marriage produced no children. He died in his 80s, having outlived Amelia by more than 4 decades. What happened to Amelia's letters to Fitzroy is, in the archival drama of the story, worth a moment. The letters, which formed the main body of the secret correspondence of the relationship, were inherited by Fitzroy. After his death, they passed through several hands before eventually arriving in the royal archives at Windsor, where they were sealed. They remained sealed for nearly 2 centuries. It is only in the last few years, with the gradual opening of the relevant collections through the Georgian Papers program, that historians have been able to read them. The letters are, by the early reports of the scholars who have begun working through them, the central body of personal writing that Amelia produced in her short adult life. They reveal a young woman of considerable intelligence, considerable wit, and considerable depth of feeling in a situation that gave her almost no scope to exercise any of those qualities openly. The work of cataloguing the letters and producing the first detailed scholarly study of the relationship is being undertaken now in our own time by a group of historians. The book that will come from this work is, as I record this episode, still in progress. By the time you watch this, it may have been published, or it may still be a few years away. Either way, the story of Amelia and Charles Fitzroy, which was carefully concealed from public view for 2 centuries, is now beginning to enter the historical record in a way that, for most of the previous 200 years, would have been impossible. There is also a dark coda to the story of Amelia's papers. After her death, a man named George Villiers, the king's bailiff, with responsibility for various royal estate matters, attempted to use some of Amelia's letters that had come into his possession to blackmail the king and the queen. Villiers had, separately, lost or stolen a sum of £280,000, an enormous sum in 1810 from royal funds under his control, and he tried to use the letters to negotiate his way out of trouble. The episode was suppressed, the letters recovered, and Villiers eventually settled into a quieter life. His son, also called George Villiers, would later become a distinguished British diplomat, the 4th Earl of Clarendon, and would represent his country with considerable success. The blackmail attempt is the ugly footnote to the much more elevated tragedy of Amelia's death, a reminder that even the most personal of stories in a royal household was always vulnerable to the predations of people who saw value in it. I want to spend the last few minutes of our evening on what Amelia's life means. taken as a whole, and on what survives of her now. The first thing to say is that her life was short and difficult, and that her death was by any reasonable measure a tragedy. She did not get to do most of the things that 27 years should give a person time to do. She did not get to marry the man she loved. She did not get to have children. She did not get to live independently. She did not get to do any of the ordinary work of building a life in the world. She was, for the whole of her brief adulthood, in some combination of physical decline, emotional confinement, and family difficulty. She bore all of it, by every account that survives, with considerable grace. The second thing to say is that she was loved. She was loved by her father, in the uncomplicated way that good fathers love their youngest children, and the love did not waver through any of the difficulties of his own illness or her own. She was loved by her sisters, Mary, with the deep love of long companionship. She was loved by her brothers, George, with the affection that survived all the difficulties of his own complicated life. She was loved, in the impossible secret way the situation required, by Charles Fitzroy. She was, throughout her short life, the centre of more love than most people of any era ever experience. The third thing to say is that she mattered. She mattered politically, in the sense that her death triggered the constitutional crisis that produced the Regency. She mattered emotionally, in the sense that her father never recovered from the loss of her. She mattered in the long way that the mostly invisible members of any family matter to the people who loved her, to Mary, who would write about her for the rest of her own life, to George, who could not hear her name without weeping, to Fitzroy, who carried her papers and her letters until his own death in his 80s, to her father, in his confusion, who spoke to her imaginary presence in the hours of the night for the last decade of his own life. She mattered in different ways and in different registers to all of them. What survives of her, in our own time, is a but distinct collection of objects and texts. There is the Copley portrait of 1785, with the 2-year-old Amelia on the stone step holding the leash of the white dog. There is the mourning ring that she ordered for her father in the last days of her life, with the lock of her hair still preserved under the crystal. There are the letters in the royal archives, slowly being read for the first time in 200 years. There is the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, where her body has lain since the 13th of November, 1810. There are the records of the household, the medical reports of her physicians, the diary entries of the people who knew her, the administrative traces that any life in a substantial household leaves behind. There is also Augusta Lodge, the building at Windsor where she died. It is still there. It is still a working royal residence within Windsor Great Park. The room in which she died is, by every reasonable inference, still part of the building. The view from her window, over the trees of the great park, is in its essentials the same view she would have seen on the morning of her death, with the same trees grown larger and the same sweep of green beyond them. The continuity of the place is one of the consolations that history offers to the people who pay attention to it. She lived in a place. The place is still there. The walls she looked at from her bed are, in some sense, still the same walls. I want to spend a final moment before we close on what happened to her sister Mary, because Mary's later life is, in its way, the surviving thread that connected Amelia's world to the much later Victorian period. Mary, who had nursed Amelia through her last 2 years, and who had been at her bedside at the moment of death, was 34 years old in November 1810. She would live for another 47 years. She would, in the end, be the longest surviving of all of George III's children, the last of the 15, the final witness to the family of her childhood, who would die in 1857 at the age of 81. She did, eventually, marry. In 1816, at the age of 40, she married her first cousin, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester, a marriage that the Queen had refused to permit for years, and that finally happened only after Queen Charlotte had accepted that the issue had been postponed beyond all reasonable limits. The marriage was not happy. The Duke of Gloucester was an awkward, somewhat self-important man, much teased in court society for his pomposity, and Mary's domestic life with him was not what it might have been with a more sympathetic husband. The marriage produced no children, but Mary, in her long widowhood after Gloucester's death in 1834, settled into a productive late life. She maintained the family connections she had established in her youth. She corresponded extensively with her surviving siblings, with Sophia, who outlived her by only a few months, and with various of her brother's surviving descendants. She kept up the correspondence with her young niece, eventually grandniece, Princess Victoria, who succeeded to the throne in 1837, and who treated her elderly Aunt Mary with considerable affection through the long Victorian decades. Mary lived to see Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. She lived to see the births of most of Victoria's 9 children. She lived through the great social and political transformations of the early Victorian period, the Reform Act, the railways, the early factory legislation, the Crimean War. She was, in her last years, a living link to a world that by the 1850s had passed almost entirely out of memory. The great-granddaughter of George II, the third, the sister of George IV and William IV, the aunt of Victoria Mary had been at the centre of the British royal family for over 80 years, and her death in 1857 closed, in a way, the long chapter that her family had opened with George III's accession in 1760. Throughout her long life, Mary kept Amelia's memory carefully. She preserved the letters that had passed between them. She maintained in her private correspondence the continuing reference to her dead younger sister that the family had largely allowed to fade. She wrote in 1850 in a letter to one of her great-nieces that she still, 40 years after Amelia's death, thought of her every day. The bond that had been formed in the nursery at Windsor in the late 1780s, when Amelia was 4 and Mary was 12 and the household was navigating the king's first illness, lasted, in Mary's keeping, until Mary's own death in 1857. There is one final detail of what survived. Among the items that came to the royal collection from various sources over the 19th century is a box containing what is believed to be the original mourning ring that Amelia had ordered for her father. The ring, with the lock of her hair still preserved under the crystal, has survived through all the long handling of the royal collection and is now part of the holdings of the royal archives. It is, in the long life of an object, perhaps the single most direct material connection that we still have to the moment we have spent the evening describing, the moment in late October 1810 when Amelia, knowing she was dying, asked the court jewellers to make a piece of jewellery for her father, and the moment a few days later when the king opened the leather case and burst into tears. The ring still exists. The hair under the crystal is still her hair. The care that she put into the gesture 2 centuries and more ago is still preserved in the physical object that her care produced. And so, as the evening with Princess Amelia ends, I want to bring you back slowly to where you actually are. We have been in our imagination with one woman through the long arc of her short life. We have been at her birth in the upstairs bedroom at the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park on the August morning of 1783, when her father wept at the news that she had arrived alive. We have been in the nursery at Windsor with her at 2 years old, on the carpet by the fire, while her father came in and dropped to one knee to play with her. We have walked the gardens at Kew with her in her teens, and taken the cold sea bathing with her at Weymouth, and watched her sister Sophia and her sister Mary settle into the long companionship of the nunnery. We have been with her through the secret correspondence with Charles Fitzroy, through the years of the impossible love. We have been at her bedside at Augusta Lodge in October and November of 1810, with Mary in the chair beside her, and the king coming up from the castle every day for his visit. We have stood with her father in the moment when he opened the case with the mourning ring and saw the lock of his daughter's hair under the crystal. We have, because an evening like this permits, been present at her death. The hour in the world that you and I actually inhabit is also late, perhaps, or early. It has been a long evening. You have been listening for some time. The room around you, wherever you are, has its own details that the script does not know about. Your own light, your own blanket, your own quiet. I hope that the picture of Amelia, of her family, of the long love that ran between her and her father, of the secret love that ran between her and Fitzroy, of the devotion of her sister Mary, has been a useful one to spend a few hours with. There is something, I think, about the private people of history that the noisy public story tends to skip over. The kings and the queens and the prime ministers and the great events of the political record are not, when one looks closely, the whole of what was happening in any given period. There are, in every period, the private people whose lives unfolded in the corners of the great events, whose names are mostly not remembered, whose stories are mostly not told. Amelia is, in her way, one of them. She lived 27 years. She did not change the political shape of her country in any direct way. She did not write the books, or paint the paintings, or compose the music that the period most remembers. But she lived, with grace and intelligence and considerable suffering, through her time. She loved and was loved. She bore her difficulties as well as anyone could have borne them. She died young, in a way that her father never recovered from. The historical record, by 2026, is finally beginning to see her. The letters are coming out of the archives. The first detailed scholarly book about her life is being written. The bright face in the Copley portrait of 1785 is becoming, slowly, the face of a person whose life can be told in detail. She is being seen. If you have enjoyed this evening, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from. There are more stories like this one. More private lives recovered from the corners of the great public records, more evenings in which a single life, slowly and carefully reconstructed, can fill the hours of a long evening at home. If you know someone who loves history or who finds comfort in the long-form pleasure of an evening recreated in detail, please share this with them. For now, sleep well. Good night.